The next page greets us with a dizzying sea of colorful Yoshis for February 1998. It's issue 12, and the editorial staff were clearly doing damage control by begging us to yell at our newsagents for that missing double game guide. The real draw here was Yoshi's story, fresh from Japan and promising the earth with its fruit-collecting antics. We all remember how this one looked. Adorable enough to cause an immediate sugar crash, though perhaps a bit too soft around the edges for those wanting a real teeth-gritting challenge. This cover for February 98 screams loud and clear with that absolute troop of Yoshis, marking issue 12. We were promised the definitive take on Yoshi's story, an attempt to fill the platforming void after Mario 64 had already occupied everyone's brain space for the better part of a year. You have got the usual mix of desperate import guides, essential for the impatient amongst us who couldn't wait for PAL release dates, and the stark juxtaposition of gritty, PC-honed violence in Quake set against the sweaty, theatrical manhandling found in WCW vs NWO World Tour. It remains a proper, diverse snapshot of 1998's rapidly evolving, and slightly disparate, gaming landscape. A bleak, full-page reminder that the cinematic trainwreck Mortal Kombat, Annihilation, haunted theaters in early '98. A forgettable footnote in both gaming and film history, purely there to drain wallets and patience. The next spread pulls us into the editorial hub, and honestly, the audacity of reviewing Japanese imports like Tamagotchi World and Robotron 64 perfectly encapsulates that '98 era where hunting down cartridges was the only way to stay current. Back before digital storefronts saved us from the struggle, you begged your local independent retailer to find an import copy, or simply went without. It's quite charming to picture the staff squeezing in GoldenEye sessions between Christmas commitments like the Queen's speech truly. That game possessed a collective social calendar of every teen in Britain at the time. They tackle the Yoshi's Story Dilemma, a game that players desperately wanted to be Mario 64's successor, though it delivered a saccharine pop-up book fever dream instead. People either wept at the gorgeous papercraft visuals, or sneered at the crushing simplicity. Then there's the mention of Snowboard Kids. Remember the minor confusion involving the inconsistent titling? The fact that nobody could agree on the spelling really sums up the lack of professional oversight in localization back then. It's honestly endearing to see the team openly admit that 9 of the 11 games reviewed that month were imported. The level of commitment to finding playable experiences, let alone translating the menu systems, was monumental compared to today's click and download culture. It reads like a gentle warning. Keep your snacks away from your equipment, lest you end up battling real-world pests while you're supposed to be polishing your Turok hunting strategy. It provides a rather grounded, slightly disheveled insight into the lives of magazine writers in the late 90s, spending more time sourcing rare software and fighting their own lunch than actually sleeping. The next page showcases the February '98 grind, where import obsession was essentially a full-time hobby, with WCW vs NWO World Tour dominating the review lineup alongside a questionable pile of exotic imports. It's clear the magazine staff were just as starved for fresh pixels as we were. You can practically smell the desperation to fill space, suggesting tactics for GoldenEye deathmatches as if we weren't already self-appointed experts by the time this hit the stands. Just look at that reliance on import coverage. Keeping up with the N64 back then wasn't just gaming, it was pure, unadulterated archaeology. The next page presents us with the impending arrival of mystical ninja starring Goemon, or simply Ganbare Goemon, if you felt like being a pretentious importer back in 1998. Watching Konami try to export this bundle of absurdity to a European audience was nothing short of a high-wire act. We weren't just looking at another platformer. We were peering into a Japanese fever dream, involving pipes, massive mechanical robots, and social commentary that went completely over our heads at the time. The editorial team's apprehension here is palpable, and frankly they were spot on. Back then, localizing a game wasn't about hiring professional screenwriters. It was often a chaotic game of telephone, where nuances, cultural shorthand and comedy were unceremoniously dumped in favor of awkward literalisms. The feature rightly points out the disastrous potential of losing the plot during the translation phase. When you read their example taking an obscure Japanese idiom about putting the kettle on and trying to find an equivalent that doesn't sound like a stroke victim wrote it, you realize just how much we take for granted now. We were essentially relying on a few stressed developers to curate our cultural intake. And can we talk about those screenshots? Even then, looking at a naked man with a bag on his head, and a town where a rude guy tells you to buzz off whilst fishing, it felt wonderfully, aggressively Japanese. It wasn't like anything being pumped out of Western studios. where we were arguably too concerned with being gritty and realistic. Konami simply didn't care about our sensibilities. They threw a giant shouting robot called Impact into the mix, and expected us to cope with the mental dissonance. It was bold, it was vibrant, and it looked like exactly the kind of fun we were craving, while the rest of the market seemed stuck in a rut. The note about sanitizing the game by removing the swastika imagery feels quaint now, though in Nagbol, 98, publishers were twitchy about literally anything that might offend the sensitive or invite bad press. They were careful to reassure us that the game's flavor remained, as if we'd know the difference without a roadmap. There was a genuine excitement in seeing this coming to European shores in April. When you look at the magazine's assessment, the anxiety about the humor not landing, the suspicion that the game was secretly trash behind the aesthetic, you see the exact cycle of hope and dread every N64 owner lived through before hitting the local shop to put down a pre-order deposit. Mystical Ninja sat in that odd middle ground. It promised an adventure that felt smarter than your average jump and collect coin effort, yet we were terrified that once it finally booted up in PAL, the joke would somehow be on us. It is a brilliant reminder of the stakes involved in gaming media before the internet stripped away the mystery. You looked at these pages, read the scribbled down warnings and the hints at greatness, and just had to trust that when the release day arrived, the game wouldn't just be another forgotten relic. For a title like this, that risk was usually worth it. This page delves straight into the delightful, slightly deranged process of trying to make sense of Mystical Ninja starring Goemon. Specifically, the magazine takes a magnifying glass to the game's lyrics, which are honestly one of the great accidental comedies of the 1998 library. When you read the editorial breakdown of that fight on track, you can practically hear the translators weeping at their desks, attempting to force poetic, culturally dense Japanese sentiment into broken, rhythmic English for the PAL release, led to lines like, well, look at the sky peeping through the clouds. It's profound in the way that an early internet horoscope is profound. It makes zero sense, but if you stare at it long enough while jamming on the Z button, you'll start to believe in the nonsense. The article takes a perfectly snarky tone, acting as our reluctant guides through the cultural disconnect. Watching the editors perform mental gymnastics to explain how the game equates fishing and rabbits to geopolitical instability or life advice is the quintessential N64 Magazine experience. They are trying to find wisdom in what is essentially a fever dream, designed to distract you from the fact that you're playing a game with very specific, often bewildering mechanics. You didn't just play Mystical Ninja to relax. You played it to understand why you were suddenly dealing with a giant mecha battle sequence that came out of absolutely nowhere. Speaking of the mecha battles, the Mechanical Madness guide is spot on regarding the shift in gameplay intensity. Moving from the standard 3D platforming which, let's face it, usually involved jumping on things that weren't clearly defined to the Goemon Impact showdowns, felt like shifting gear in a beat-up family estate car. The developers clearly loved the classic cheesy anime tropes of the giant robot intros, and they were banking on the fact that we wouldn't question why we were piloting a giant gold-clad mechanical version of the protagonist while shouting out loud at our televisions. This, fundamentally, was the appeal of the title. It was fearless, the "I am machinery, I am a metal being" lyrics helpfully transcribed for us by a reporter, clearly having a stroke, while writing the captions epitomized the tone. We didn't need a perfectly translated, poignant narrative. We needed giant bosses that resembled a super punch-out training sequence gone horribly wrong. The inclusion of the Yaya reveal, even just in that small snippet, reinforces why we loved this title. You weren't getting some dark, gritty, westernized story about a soldier behind enemy lines. You were getting a ninja who sings badly, meets a girl who has become a mermaid for some reason, and then punches a building-sized robot because the game decided it was time. Looking back at these screens, the aesthetic holds up simply because it never tried to be cool. It tried to be eccentric. That bravery, backed by the editors acknowledging just how bizarre it all was, created an incredible amount of anticipation. It didn't matter if the translations were shaky, it just meant the adventure was going to be a completely unscripted, wildly hilarious ride. Next we have the absolute grit and grime of Quake 64. Back in early 1998, when owning a Pentium-class PC was a status symbol rather than a landfill statistic, the mere idea of cramming id Software's masterpiece onto the Nintendo 64 was borderline black magic. It wasn't perfect, and let's not pretend it was a technical miracle, but Midway managed to deliver a port that didn't cause the cartridge to melt into the console's casing, which, let's be honest, was a victory in itself. Looking at this page you can almost taste the dust and those lovely low-resolution brown textures that defined an entire era of first-person shooters. The editorial staff is clearly having a laugh at the grim nature of the bestiary, highlighting monsters that look like they've crawled out of a skip behind a local pub. That caption labeling a hellish, pulsating demon as Michael from Croydon? Absolutely brilliant, just the sort of absurd, dry British humour that separated these magazines from the sterile, corporate gaming guides that would inevitably take over later. The burning question, as always with these ports, was whether it actually played well. Trying to steer a digital crosshair with that three-pronged monstrosity of a controller was never going to offer the surgical precision of a mouse and keyboard setup. You can tell the writers felt that frustration. It wasn't the fluid experience that the PC elite were flaunting, but it allowed us, the console masses, to finally join the deathmatch movement without needing to fiddle with IRQ settings or deal with dial-up internet trauma. The trade-off for this convenience was a bloody massacre of the source material. The level count was slashed to a fraction of the PC original, and that promised 16-player mayhem was culled down to a somber, 2-player split-screen affair. Is it a shame they cut the maps? Obviously. It felt like they'd taken a butcher's knife to a prime cut, leaving us with just the starter menu. However, getting the Quake engine to run at a frame rate that didn't stutter like a caffeinated hamster was a genuinely shocking achievement for the hardware. The weapon feel, specifically that satisfying punch of the nailgun, somehow survived the translation unscathed. The explosives look suitably fiery for a piece of tech born in the mid-90s. And despite the inescapable, mud-soaked color palette that made every game look like it was viewed through a dirty teabag, the oppressive atmosphere actually works. You didn't boot up Quake 64 because you expected to find technical perfection or more maps than you knew what to do with. You played it because, finally, you had the big league shooter in the living room, ready to be hammered at 2 a.m. after the pub closed. Even if it felt a bit cut down, at the time, it was more than enough. The next page drags us into the shiny, over-polished world of Konami's NBA Pro 98, as if we hadn't already had our fill of trying to make polygon count men chase a bouncing orange orb. It is typical of the era to assume that because a game carries the Pro suffix, we are supposed to collectively swoon at the promise of a full simulation experience, rather than expecting what we usually got, players gliding around like they were auditioning for Swan Lake. Konami, in their infinite wisdom, were aiming to scrub the arcade-like veneer of their previous efforts, and present us with something that actually felt like the real thing. To be fair, seeing 29 teams and the licensed all-star rosters in 1998 felt like a massive step up from the limited selection of squads we had previously been fed. The screens capture the game in its mid-development phase, roughly 30% complete, according to the magazine's estimations, which serves as a convenient excuse for why the court looks like it was generated by someone squinting through a thick layer of Vaseline. There is an endearing sort of cheekiness in the way the magazine addresses the fuzz, that N64 fog was the absolute bane of every gamer's life back then, as it turned perfectly good basketball arenas into dimly lit subterranean grottos where the crowd might as well have been a static JPEG. They joke about the technical issues with that typical dry British humour, knowing full well that half the time you couldn't tell the difference between a foul shot and an attempted jump from the three-point line, because the resolution made everyone look like an oddly shaped pile of potatoes. Take note of the commentary on the wobble gauge for penalty shots. It is hilarious that in their pursuit of simulation, the solution was simply to tack on a rhythm action minigame. You wanted the thrill of athletic prowess, and you got a fluctuating bar that required more button mashing tension than actually playing the sport. It highlights that strange period in gaming design where developers thought layering gimmicky mechanics over base gameplay was the golden ticket to authenticity. Then there is the bizarre decision regarding the replay camera angles. The screenshots clearly demonstrate some of the most baffling perspectives imaginable. Who would voluntarily switch to a low-angle shot that cuts off half the court? It speaks to a dev team struggling with the new frontier of 3D, unsure of how to guide the player's eye without leaving them feeling disoriented. Yet, for all its warts, there was that desperate anticipation for the March launch. We kept our fingers crossed that by the final build they would clear up the graphical haze and iron out the awkward controls, ultimately hoping for a basketball experience that didn't feel like a collection of sprites arguing in a fog bank. Next we have a quintessential Planet 64 spread that perfectly captures the specific agony of being a console owner, waiting for the good stuff back in early 1998. It is a bleak timeline, really. The editors are practically begging for a trickle of decent software, and looking at this list while stuffed with promise serves as a painful reminder of just how agonizing those delays were. Seeing the calendar layout is quite amusing because those dates were purely speculative, essentially serving as a prayer that Nintendo wouldn't push our patience to breaking point. We had the horizon-promising titles like Banjo-Kazooie, the gravity-defying F-Zero X, and of course, the Titan waiting in the wings Zelda 64. That period was a psychological endurance test. You had to convince yourself that whatever arrived between those massive blockbuster releases was worth the time spent squinting at the screen, hoping for gameplay depth rather than just high-poly window dressing. Speaking of window dressing, note the casual bashing of the release schedule. They mention Cruisin' USA falling to the £25 mark, which is fair. Trying to sell a subpar arcade port at full retail price to a starved audience was daylight robbery, and seeing the price slashed was probably the only sensible thing the industry did all year. It makes you realize how fragile our collective goodwill was back then. One bad racing port after another, and you'd have been eyeing the rival machines with envy. The editorial on the game delays hits close to home. The industry was just starting to shift away from the days when games actually released on time and finished, moving into the era where a title with N64 on the box was often essentially an open beta test. When they talk about Body Harvest and the general list of 1998, they aren't just giving news, they are projecting our collective desperation for anything that didn't play like it had been held together with spit and glue. You remember those conversations, standing around in the schoolyard or the office debating whether Zelda would ever actually arrive, or if we'd be rotting in our chairs before Link ever pulled the Master Sword. As for that bizarre sidebar on Pokémon, a proper reminder of how volatile the late 90s were. Who would have thought that a Saturday morning cartoon could trigger an impromptu health warning across the Japanese islands? It sounds like something invented by a panicked school administrator, but alas, it was just the visual excess of the times hitting too hard. It really drives home that we were the pioneers of high-frequency visual stimulation, occasionally at the cost of our own neurological sanity. This page serves as a capsule of that time, where hardware prices were dropping like stones because they had to, and our patience for developers was thin, even if our hope for the next big Rare or Nintendo release was as sturdy as ever. It is quite a sobering thought that we waited months, sometimes years, for titles that we'd now play for a weekend and set aside, yet in 1998 they were everything. The next page serves up the typical scattershot aesthetic of late 90s enthusiast media, balancing the utterly mundane task of marketing glorified plastic keychains with a reasonably competent history lesson. We begin in the new goods section, a delightful little reminder that, in 1998, we were truly susceptible to buying anything slapped with a Nintendo logo. The industry clearly thought that if they produced enough tiny, low-grade plastic keychains or cumbersome screen enhancers, we would eagerly empty our pockets. It is hard to look back at that without feeling a sharp pang of embarrassment for our younger selves. We really treated that excess gameware plastic-like high fashion for the digital age. Most of these gimmicks, specifically the reset switch keychain that required a pencil to operate, are perfect emblems of a time when we were so desperate for N64 connectivity, we'd settle for basically any branded debris just to signal to our peers that we were in fact gamers. Then we shift into Retroword, which manages to capture the peculiar bitterness that defined the hardware wars of the early 90s. Jason Moore takes us through the Atari Lynx, which frankly was the victim of one of the greatest PR drubbings in tech history. It's almost physically painful to read about. We all know how it went down. You have this device that, on paper, made the original Game Boy look like a rudimentary brick with a headache-inducing monochromatic display. It had a backlit color screen, proper ergonomics, and the ambition of a powerhouse. Yet Nintendo, in their infinite terrifying wisdom, realized that if you make a device that actually has the decency to stay turned on for longer than 20 minutes, people might actually buy it. The bit about the Metal Gear reference in the piece is particularly delicious because, at the time, that early 8-bit aesthetic was essentially all we had, and we defended it with religious fervor. Comparing it to the Metal Gear legacy shows how these titles tried to emulate the silver screen, even when limited by processing power that couldn't even render a decent polygon without catching fire. The retrospective here highlights that fundamental divide between the machines we played and the ones we wished were actually viable. It really highlights how doomed the Lynx was. Not because it lacked capability, but because the average user wasn't ready to invest in a battery budget comparable to the GDP of a small island nation just to play some handheld ports on a bus. As for the miscellaneous bits like the stereo RF modulators and the archaic climber game and watch, they occupy that weird space of Ringo, retro landfill. They are the items you find in an attic years later, tangled in a rat's nest of yellowing cables, wondering why on earth you paid good money to force stereo sound out of hardware that could barely handle its own operating frequency. It serves as a grounded reality check. While we were lusting after the latest titles, the hardware experience was often a constant battle against clunky connectors, poor signal quality, and the persistent fear that the whole contraption might just go kaput if you looked at it sideways. It was an era of brute force solutions, and looking at this spread really underlines just how much we've taken stable hardware for granted since then. Next, we find ourselves diving headfirst into the high-octane, sweat-soaked world of N64 sports gaming. It's an interesting mix here. One title that was destined to define what the hardware was truly capable of, and others that served as harsh reminders of why iterative annual sports updates were starting to feel rather tedious even back then. The undeniable highlight in this spread is the coverage of 1080-degree snowboarding. This wasn't just a release, it was a bona fide event. We all knew that when Nintendo set their sights on physics, particularly by applying that slippery, beautiful fluidity they perfected in Wave Race 64, it was time to pay attention. The anticipation surrounding the development team, bolstered by ex-Argonaut talent, wasn't just mindless hype, it was a grounded belief that this would handle like a dream. Those previews of night racing with flaming torches were genuinely revolutionary back then. Even as the writers tempered expectations about potential delays, there was an underlying palpable confidence in the page. It promised a sensation of speed and tactile control that, in the late 90s, really did feel like it was miles ahead of anything else on the market. Contrast that excitement with the blunt, crushing honesty applied to Wayne Gretzky's 3D Hockey '98. There is nothing quite like that specific feeling of realization, the sinking moment when you see a sequel and realize it is identical to the previous title, only with marginally different menus. The review doesn't pull any punches, effectively calling it out for being a glorified patch. It perfectly captures that mid to late 90s frustration with sports titles that operated on autopilot, banking on the assumption that players would mindlessly drop cash for a fresh date on the box art, while ignoring the glaring lack of genuine innovation underneath. Finally, we are given a taste of the frenzy building up for World Cup '98. Using the robust FIFA '98 engine was, in fairness, a solid starting point. The page is dripping with the unique brand of optimism we reserved for Ian's big-ticket releases, where the headline isn't about deep mechanics, but the celebrity commentary of Gary Lineker and Chris Waddle. We were such easy targets back then. Throw a few legendary names into a box and suggest a classic mode, and suddenly we were ready to ignore the lack of actual game improvements just to relive some footballing glory. It's a quaint glimpse at the industry's marketing machine working its absolute magic on us, well before the time when we'd eventually become wise to the whole recurring revenue dance. The next page plunges us into the feverish anticipation of the N64's future, balancing the pure, unadulterated speed of future racing with the gothic, jagged edges of an early 3D platformer experiment. Let's be honest, F-Zero X was the game that promised to solve our collective hunger for sheer velocity. Back then, there was this lingering concern that 3D visuals meant sacrificing speed, but the promise of 30 racers screaming around the track at a mind-bending 1,000 km/h put those worries to bed. Looking at those screenshots of Mute City, you can practically hear the electronic soundtrack pulsating through your brain. That machine select screen wasn't just a list of cars, it was a buffet of choices that we knew would lead to endless weekends arguing over which pilot was theoretically superior. We all knew that playing F-Zero wasn't just about winning, it was about the sickening tension of hanging off the edge of a track that loops into a corkscrew while every other racer tries to punt you into the abyss. Seeing a stable frame rate at that speed was the real witchcraft here. Then, there's Castlevania 64, known then as the mysterious Dracula 3D. Moving a beloved, stiff, and challenging 2D platforming legend into a three-dimensional world was, historically speaking, a recipe for frustration. We had high hopes that Konami would nail the atmospheric lighting and those dark, menacing castles, but deep down, we knew what we were actually looking at, a battle with a camera system that would likely fight you harder than the actual vampires. They teased characters like Cornell, the lycanthrope brawler, and the pint-sized magic user Carrie, hoping to sell us on the story. Yet, everyone knew that exploring those 3D spaces meant navigating precarious ledges, leading to as many accidental tumbles into the dark as successful jumps. The visuals were quite the spectacle for the time, leaning into the grainy, murky look of 90s gothic horror, but the gameplay loop remained the big, unspoken question mark looming over our gaming sessions. We wanted it to be good, we desperately needed a great Castlevania, but we all suspected the camera controls would ultimately decide the game's fate. On the other side of the spread, we have a bold, red advertisement for WCW vs NW World Tour. It's a loud invitation to ruin your social life by arguing over 4-player head-to-head wrestling matches, cementing the N64's reputation as the ultimate multiplayer king. This page brings us to the altar of all things Hylian, because, frankly, were we ever not talking about Zelda back in the winter of '98? The magazine is buckling under the immense, unrelenting weight of anticipation for the arrival of what we all eventually learned to call Ocarina of Time. Looking back at those screenshots, the early iterations of the Hall of Time, the sight of a very low-poly Link trying to chuck a bomb into a Dodongo's unsuspecting gob, it feels almost quaint. The HUD and the textures were the absolute pinnacle of technological achievement then, even if looking at them now is like staring into the dusty corners of a favourite attic. Will Overton's artwork is the star of the show here, perfectly capturing that slightly manic hero-in-waiting energy that Link just couldn't shake. It was a time when the mere sight of a few 3D screens of Hyrule was enough to justify the price of the magazine alone, sparking feverish debates about how exactly this transformation to 3D would hold up compared to the previous, static entries. Then, shifting over to the Misa Ask Fusoya column, we're treated to a delicious masterclass in the particular brand of suffering unique to gamers of that era. It really was a dark, frustrating time to be a PAL player. You have folks genuinely writing in to ask about obscure Sailor Moon titles that stood about as much chance of making it over here as a snowflake in the proverbial fire, and poor, deluded dreamers hoping against hope for a Chrono Trigger 64. Oh, you absolute sweet summer children. The section reads like a eulogy for the lost, with everyone desperately scrambling to import Super Mario RPG. For those who didn't live it, you cannot comprehend the sheer, jagged annoyance of regional import adapters. We spent entire fortunes on these finicky, overpriced hunks of plastic that claimed to bypass Nintendo's lockdown procedures, only to inevitably fail, glitch out, or simply turn our consoles into very expensive doorstops. It was the constant, background noise of our hobby, peering across the pond at all the spectacular Square games we were being denied, while cursing the manufacturers who refused to send them our way. Reading these letters today is a stark reminder of that feeling, half annoyance, half obsessive love, where we were all collectively holding our breath, hoping for a miracle that, in the case of those specific RPGs, usually ended in a bitter disappointment. It really was the golden age of being an N64 devotee, constantly hunting, always hoping, and occasionally just getting burned. The next page presents a delightful cross-section of early N64 optimism, complete with the kind of industry-leading promises that made that specific era both incredible and uniquely frustrating. First, we have Biofreaks, courtesy of Midway. Now, casting your mind back, if you weren't playing the undisputed fighting titans of the day, you were often left sifting through the pile of would-be contenders trying to snag that elusive crown. Biofreaks, with its grim, desolate arena combat and projectile-heavy chaos, was essentially marketed to satisfy that post-MK thirst. The editorial waxes lyrical about the camera zoom mechanics being a revolutionary step for the medium, whereas those of us who suffered through it recall that it was just a fantastic way to lose situational awareness while your fighter got pummeled into the ground. It was pitched as a massive step forward, yet the experience was about as polished as a jagged rock you found in your trainer. It had all the grittiness required, just lacking that final layer of refined control that the truly great games managed to nail. Then there is Jest. Honestly, looking at these renders of our Jester hero today is like peering into a bizarre time capsule of character design, where everyone in the development office decided the mascot just had to have a sneer to be taken seriously. It is classic, distinctively unpolished production, all colorful, slightly skewed geometry and ambition, destined to be the sort of title that lingered on shop shelves until the clearance stickers finally put it out of its misery. You would often go in hoping for a glimpse of the next great 3D platformer, only to end up with games that handled with all the agility of a fully loaded supermarket trolley on a tiled floor. It is cute in that desperate 90s trying too hard to be extreme way, but I'm certain we all remember the sting of spending precious cash on something that, quite frankly, just felt like it needed another 6 months in the oven. Regarding the editorial column, they are gossiping about the dream of seeing head over heels arriving on the 64. That was the quintessential industry rum mill grinding to a halt, as we were all collectively desperate for those older classic titles to get a fresh coat of polygonal paint. It was a lovely, hazy dream, but like many whispers from that period, it remained just that, a whisper. As for the gargantuan gameplay advertisement block cluttering up the right side of the spread, it serves as a rather brutal reminder of the Holam premium price of entry, with games retailing for roughly £60 in currency that felt significantly harder to come by. The list is a reminder of the barrier to entry we faced in the UK market. We were treated as an afterthought, forced to shell out a fortune for imports and standard stock, and somehow, we all paid it anyway. That list is a cold, hard reminder of the era. Eye-watering prices for the latest hits, provided purely so we could avoid the agony of missing out on the zeitgeist. A classic 90s tease. A calendar of, coming soon, hopes, headlined by the mythical Zelda 64, paired with a mail-order list designed purely to rinse our wallets for expensive imported games. Next, we have a little sojourn to the arcades of Japan, thanks to Max Everingham's rather taxing assignment of playing cabinets that the rest of us will, at best, encounter in the darkest corners of an occasional seaside funfair. The Japanese arcade experience has always been this mix of blinding neon, questionable physical exercise, and cabinets that cost more to rent than a small apartment. First up, we have Motor Raid, because when you think of high-octane two-wheeled death-defying races, you definitely want to equip your bike with a scythe to swipe at your opponents. It is typical, beautifully insane Sega logic. Forget about driving lines or realistic braking zones, just focus on not getting hacked to pieces by the person riding beside you. It's absolute lunacy, and yet there's an irresistible charm to it. You know that for 3 minutes you are the king of the world, and by the end of it you've pulled a muscle or two. The same cannot be said for Le Mans 24. We've all seen our fair share of racing games that promised the earth and delivered a sluggish mess that handles like a tank in a car park. Being unrealistic is usually a criticism, but when a machine requires you to actively resist the force feedback just to navigate a gentle corner, perhaps clumsy is the more appropriate descriptor. Then we move on to water ski and Harley-Davidson and L.A. riders. Honestly, one is a rather beige affair about simulating the thrills of dragging your feet in the water, and the other attempts to put us on a bike in-law while we're effectively standing on a piece of plastic in an arcade. Finally, there is the legendary final furlong. We have to admire the sheer audacity of Taito here, charging people money to essentially ride a rocking horse in a frantic, sweaty rhythm game. You look utterly ridiculous doing it, but if you actually win that digital derby, who cares what the punters behind you are laughing at? Transitioning from the sweating of the arcades to the quiet despair of the N64 release schedule, the reality sets in. We're in the thick of a classic standoff where we just want good games, but the hardware supply isn't quite catching up with the appetite for destruction. It's almost painful reading about the scramble for N64 software, with the Japanese market having its own love affair with Capcom fighters on the Saturn while we're left waiting for the next Zelda masterpiece to descend from the heavens. The obscure mentions of games like Denryu Iral Robu remind us that there was a whole world of weird, niche Japanese content, typically attached to strange TV shows that we'd never lay eyes on. That Trident controller, with its sensitive analog stick, was desperate for something beyond the initial launch titles to sink our teeth into, even if we were just trying to hold on until the next big wave of hits. And don't even get us started on the lengths one goes to just for a poster of Mario or Zelda from Nintendo Space World. We're such loyal suckers, aren't we? If a company promised us a sticker in exchange for our soul, there would likely be a queue around the block. That is the magic of the 90s, where every crumb of news from Japan felt like it was hand-delivered from a future we were desperately trying to reach. At least we now have some handy Japanese phrases to shout when the inevitable lag hits our own console titles back home. Itai is going to be the default scream whenever we fall off Rainbow Road for the 1000th time. The next double-page spread functions as the beating heart of our monthly frustration and hope, where the N64 Magazine editorial team lays their cards on the table. This is where we sift through the upcoming dross and gold, a necessary reality check, before we empty our pockets on another 60-quid cartridge that might either become the centerpiece of our collection or a doorstop by the end of the month. Take the look at the N-Meisei, N-Meisei, N-Neina, N-Meisei, N-Neina segment. It's basically an expensive window shopping exercise for the brave few, with multi-region converters and bank accounts that don't mind getting hammered by Japanese markups. It's a bit pathetic, isn't it? Looking at Tamagotchi World 64 or Snowbow Kids games that represent a parallel universe of content we won't touch for an eternity. The section highlights the agonizing gap between the Japanese library, where weird experimentations thrive, and the drip feed of Western releases that left us parched. It's cruel, but at least the pictures are colorful while we sit here counting the days until something actually decent arrives. Speaking of decent, they've dangled WCW vs NWO World Tour and Nagano Winter Olympics in front of us. Wrestling titles are starting to get serious, moving away from those dreadful pixelated slapfests of the past, so if THQ actually puts in some effort, it might just work. As for the Winter Olympics, one assumes it's mainly about thrashing the analog stick until your thumb blisters. Good for a laugh on a rainy Saturday, but rarely a life-altering experience. Then we have the scoring hierarchy. They've gone and divided their entire review culture into a strict, colorful scale of shame. From that coveted Star Game badge, which is basically a stamp of sainthood for developers who actually finish their product, down to the grey void of a 0% rating for the truly lazy, unmitigated trash. It is a rigid, unforgiving system, but frankly, considering the cost of software back then, it's exactly the kind of blunt honesty we needed. No room for ambiguity. If it's bad, you deserve the red ink treatment. The highlight here is undoubtedly meeting the culprits behind the ratings team 64. You've got the motley crew of Jonathan Davies, Andrea Ball, Will Overton, James Ashton, Jonathan Nash, Tim Weaver, and Dean Mortlock. They all look like they've aged 5 years in the last 5 minutes of trying to decide if Yoshi's story is actually worth playing or just pretty to look at. Seeing their Game of the Month picks gives you an insight into their psyche. Will clearly values his peace and quiet given his love for mystical ninja, while others are clearly struggling to balance a social life with the demands of sitting in a dark room playing through obscure beat 'em ups. It's reassuring to know that the people grading our future purchases are as hopelessly committed to the hardware as the rest of us, even if they're getting a bit irritable about it. The next double-page spread is dedicated to the moment we collectively swapped our mild amusement at the quaint, slow-motion belly-bumping of British wrestling giants for the glossy, pyrotechnic-heavy theatrics of the American invasion. Let's be honest, back then American wrestling seemed less like a sport and more like an overproduced, glitz-covered soap opera on steroids. And WCW vs NWO World Tour was the catalyst that proved our N64 could handle that manic energy without suffering an existential crisis. We've all got memories of those agonizingly dull British sporting days, where an evening involved watching giant haystacks try to find his footing, so having the N64 deliver something as tight as World Tour felt like stepping out of the dark ages. Finally, THQ realized that a wrestling game shouldn't be about mashing buttons until your thumbs turn to pulp. It needed timing, a bit of actual grey matter, and the ability to hold your own under pressure. The review touches on the spirit meter, which was the game's greatest masterstroke. It wasn't just there for decoration, it turned every grapple into a mental standoff. Watch it hit red, and you're agoner pinned and humiliated by anyone who understood the nuances of the game, leaving you scrambling to reverse your fate before the referee hits the 3 count. The presentation of the review is classic stuff, mocking the absurdity of the sport while acknowledging that deep down, there's nothing more satisfying than pinning your best mate for the 15th time in a row. It asks whether this is a leotard-heavy fist bash or a tarted-up ballet for fat blokes. A summary that frankly describes the entire appeal of wrestling far more accurately than any brochure. That price tag though, 55 quid back in '98, that was a serious amount of pocket money, or birthday cash, and developers were lucky if we decided to gamble it on something as unproven as a wrestling game. Fortunately, this wasn't just fluff. The engine was robust, the grapple system was light years ahead of what the competition was vomiting onto consoles, and seeing that iconic, brooding mug of Hollywood Hulk Hogan plastered across the page really set the tone for what we were dealing with. It's funny looking back, we weren't just playing a game, we were essentially engaging in a very high-stakes version of rock, paper, scissors with suplexes. If you mastered the reversal, you were a god. If you panicked, you spent your entire gaming session looking at the canvas. It was unforgiving, it was bizarre, and despite the absurd nature of the wrestling genre, it kept us tethered to the TV screen long into the early hours of the morning, praying our thumbs would recover in time for school. Next we descend into the roster bios, where the magazine editors seemingly abandoned any shred of journalistic integrity to craft their own eccentric fan fiction about these legendary brawlers. It's patently obvious they had entirely too much fun putting this together, treating professional athletes with the kind of disrespectful, side-eye hilarity only a tired magazine staff in the late 90s could manage. Looking back, the sheer disregard for professional decorum is peak print media brilliance. You have poor Dean Malenko, a genuine technical master, reduced to a footnote about having apocalyptic halitosis, and Rick Steiner permanently branded as a dog-faced gremlin. It's entirely unfair, completely baseless, and yet it fits the tone of the American invasion perfectly. The magazine writers caught onto the absurdity before any of us had a chance to digest the cultural shift. They knew these wrestling stars weren't just athletes, they were cartoons in spandex, and the profiles were written to reflect that. The roster selection here acts as a testament to the chaotic variety THQ shoved onto the cartridge. Seeing the factions divided, WCW, the encroaching NWO, and those filler cohorts, Dead or Alive and the Independent Union, is a funny trip back in time. Who actually utilized the generic fodder of the EU and W slots? Very few. We all migrated to the stars, either to master the technical speedsters like Rey Mysterio Jr., or to just steamroll over opposition using the powerhouse behemoths. Even back then, players knew better than to pay mind to those bizarre grr factor scores. Giving someone an arbitrary number between 4 and 10 feels like a schoolteacher grading a pupil on how much they smell, rather than anything constructive. We didn't care about accurate biographies. We cared about who could actually grapple, and, crucially, who had the most satisfying finisher. Trying to read through these bios while clutching the controller, with a mate impatiently tapping his foot next to you, was a universal experience. You scanned the list for your main, checked for any cheeky movesets, and immediately dived back into the arena. This isn't a strategy guide in the traditional sense. It's an entertaining scrapbook from an era where we didn't have the internet to spoil everything, so we relied on these magazines to act as our filter for who was good and who was bobbins. Reading these descriptions, it is quite remarkable how they sold us on the spectacle rather than the simulation. It captured the unhinged energy of the sport itself, where logic took a backseat to sheer, loud, sweaty entertainment. Honestly, in a time when we were mostly just mashing buttons and hoping for a pinfall, that was precisely the sort of guidance we needed. The next page brings us deeper into the, frankly bizarre index of fighters THQ decided to pack into this cartridge. It's truly a masterclass in contrasting the absolute giants of professional wrestling with an array of original characters who look like they wandered off the set of a knockoff martial arts film from the late 80s. You've got Kevin Nash and Scott Hall sat there, icons of the sport, positioned right next to mysterious rogues like Karage Jamisa, Black Ninja, and Gay Oasis Saladin. One has to wonder if the game's developers at Aki Corporation had a bet on how many distinct, pseudo-wrestling archetypes they could fit into a single save file before the memory packs gave up in despair. The profiles themselves continue to be a treat of questionable journalistic standard. We are treated to the helpful guide on utilizing furniture during a match. The Any Old Iron Bar segment is, essentially, the tactical blueprint for every adolescent gamer who discovered the joyous thrill of braining their friend with a steel folding chair instead of performing actual technical wrestling maneuvers. And why shouldn't we? It's arguably more satisfying to end a heated button-mashing brawl by walloping someone with a weapon, a feeling the writers capture with perfect, dry wit. They treat these simple gameplay mechanics like they're uncovering arcane secrets, as if knowing how to pick up a weapon is akin to performing surgery. Then there is the Ye, Who's the Boss feature. They lean quite heavily into this Scooby-Doo mystery vibe, talking about masks and hidden identities, as if the primary challenge wasn't actually finding an opening in your opponent's guard. It highlights a recurring theme for the era. Everything needed a hook, even if that hook was just, this bloke wears a funny hat. We all recall spending entirely too much time in the League Challenge, grinding through these tiers to unlock the real main eventers, essentially suffering through a gauntlet of jobbers and mid-card enigmas to finally earn the right to wrestle as someone who wasn't essentially filler. It's hilarious looking back at the grr factor scores assigned to these rogues. You have figures like The Unknown boasting massive ratings, looking for all the world like they belong in a budget fighting game, sitting shoulder to shoulder with genuine wrestling legends. But that was the charm of the N64 era. You didn't care that Poochteka might have been a completely fabricated entity. If he had a move that hit hard or looked absurd enough, he was straight onto the team roster. These pages serve as a brilliant time capsule of that mindset, half focused on the legitimate sport and half completely consumed by the spectacle of it all, provided with enough cheek and personality to keep us reading while the console purred in the background. It is irreverent, gloriously silly, and entirely appropriate for a game that understood, deep down, we were all just there to spam our favorite finishers. The next page finds us digging further into this motley crew of oddballs, Black Belt, Pakaloko, Shaman, and Master Fuji. You've got to admire the absolute commitment required to look at a wrestler named Pakaloko and craft a biography for him, as if he isn't essentially a rejected Saturday morning cartoon villain. And that, grr factor, rating system? One can only assume it was the 90s way of determining how cross a fighter looked while stuck in a headlock. It's all terribly charming nonsense, quite frankly, and perfectly fitting for a title that padded out its roster with as many distinct pixelated monstrosities as the hardware would allow, before the console decided it had seen enough. Then we arrive at the sage-like wisdom of Hollywood Hulk Hogan, providing tips on how to effectively cheat. It's a beautiful thing, really. They write as if smashing an opponent with a chair or abusing the ropes is akin to a high-level chess maneuver, when we all know it was usually just a desperate, frantic mashing of the A and B buttons, whilst praying the collision detection didn't throw a wobbler. These tutorials on executing move sets like the shoulder breaker or the stomp read almost suspiciously sophisticated. You scan the instructions, and you can practically hear that tinny, repetitive crunch sound effect from the TV, followed by the movement being just a tad bit heavier than you'd like. The write-up here hits the nail on the head regarding the beef combo. It's essentially a fight against the game's own stiff interface. Even at the time, when we were starved for anything three-dimensional, there was a palpable feeling of, well, it's wrestling, I suppose. The review itself is balanced, leaning toward an honest reality. It was a landmark game, sure, but it wasn't exactly smooth. That 70% verdict is arguably the most generous pat on the back one could award. It's a game with an identity crisis, trying to act like a polished, technical fighter while stuck inside the frankly blocky confines of an early N64 engine. Those subscores of 6s and 7s across the board paint a vivid picture of a title that had the charisma to get by on the license alone, even if the actual act of playing it was more chore than thrill. It's a definitive artifact of the era's experimental awkwardness, complete with spandex, bad audio, and that uniquely frustrating joy of finally hitting your finisher after 5 failed attempts. The next page drags us, somewhat reluctantly, to the icy slopes of Nagano Winter Olympics, '98, and quite frankly, it serves as a timely reminder that not every digital venture into athletic competition needs to see the light of day. It is an Olympic title from Konami, a developer that we generally hold in fairly high regard, but on this particular occasion the end result has all the enthusiasm of a wet weekend in Bognor. You must admire the honesty of the review's snoozometer. We've all played those games where you find yourself genuinely fighting the urge to nap while still clutching the controller, but to have it physically represented on the page? That's gold. It tracks the excitement levels as you endure the downhill skiing, which consists largely of gently nudging the joystick and trying not to fall asleep at the controls. It attempts to simulate the thrills of professional skiing, but ends up feeling more like waiting in a dentist's reception area, while a grainy, low-res video of a slope plays on a loop in the background. The critique really strikes a nerve when discussing the visual fidelity of the crowd, or lack thereof. Mentioning those cardboard cutouts hits the nail on the head. You are sat there, eyes glued to a television screen hooked up to arguably the most powerful console of the era, looking at spectators who seem to be cut from the same stiff cloth as a soggy Weetabix. It really highlights that gap between developer ambition and the harsh reality of early 3D polygons trying to render human presence. Then, there's the skiing itself. It is a laborious process of tilting the stick and trying to navigate the gates, but the feeling of speed is tragically absent. If you recall the visceral, pulse-pounding intensity of 1080-degree snowboarding, then playing this feels akin to trading in a rocket ship for a bicycle with a flat tire. It simply lacks that arcade crunch, that just one more go, addictive quality. The snowboarding event specifically feels tacked on as a response to the success of other, far superior titles on the N64, yet it manages to capture absolutely none of the grace. It is essentially a technical demonstration of how to bore the player to death across various sporting disciplines. You might think the halfpipe would save the day with some stunts, but that too ends up as a chore. Performing tricks here involves tapping sequences of buttons with all the flair of a damp tea towel. There is no joy in the landing, only relief that the event has finally concluded. Konami's Nagano Winter Olympics serves as the perfect example of why titles aimed at the broad, non-committal sports market during that era often failed. It lacks the technical mastery or the fun factor required to survive in an N64 library, which was becoming increasingly ruthless in its demands for quality. Unless you have an unexplainable passion for aggressively mediocre winter simulations and enjoy a steady climb of zazz as you play, you'd be better served avoiding this icy disaster entirely. It's one for the bin of history, a relic of an era when developers thought any game with Olympic in the title would sell like hotcakes. Spoilers, it didn't, and rightfully so. This page offers a masterclass in how to format a guide for a game you desperately wish wasn't in your console tray. It lays out the events of Konami's Nagano Winter Olympics with all the enthusiasm of a schoolmaster handing out detention slips. You get the standard breakdown of how to play, if you can even call these button-mashing chores, playing, and brilliantly, the magazine's editors have opted to decorate the entire spread with rows of Z's, suggesting that even their staff were falling asleep while drafting the tips. It is quite possibly the first time in print history where a guide actively warns you against the product it's supposed to be helping you master. Let's be honest about the mechanics here. The section for speed skating tells you to tap L and R rhythmically, which is presumably the digital equivalent of watching paint dry while doing star jumps. And the bobsleigh entry, the effects section candidly admits the game made the testers feel physically sick. If that doesn't inspire you to run out and buy a copy immediately, I don't know what will. It is refreshing, really, to see a gaming publication drop the PR mask and tell you straight. These events are mind-numbingly dull. The highlight, if you can call it that, has to be the curling guide. It describes it as an experience comparable to spending 6 months in solitary confinement, and judging by the static, low-effort screenshots, one can hardly disagree. Trying to channel the intensity of curling on an N64 controller is about as successful as teaching a brick to sing. The whole design is a monumental irony. You have an expensive piece of hardware capable of rendering high-fidelity 3D environments, yet the software requires you to sit there, moving almost nothing, staring at frozen pixels while a Zez trail slowly swallows your screen. It's almost a performance art piece about boredom. It is particularly sad when you think about what else Konami was capable of. We've seen them put out titles with genuine tension and excitement, yet here we are, meticulously detailing how to nudge a stick in a luge simulator that clearly lacks any sense of G-force or speed. There's a stark contrast between this and the genuine adrenaline one gets from, say, pulling off a daring drift in Mario Kart or the slick, crisp control of International Superstar Soccer. Those games felt like the future. Nagano feels like a spreadsheet designed by someone who hates the very concept of winter. When you arrive at that brutal 32% verdict at the bottom, it feels less like a harsh review and more like a public service announcement. The consensus from the editorial team is essentially, stay away, which is exactly the kind of unvarnished opinion the era was known for. It wasn't about sugarcoating every release to keep publishers happy. If a game was a dud, it was going to be publicly shamed. And that is why this is such a classic artifact of the period. We didn't have internet forums to debate scores into the ground. We had these pages, telling us firmly that sometimes an Olympic title is just a fast track to disappointment and an empty wallet. This page presents the Import Arena's take on Yoshi's Story, a game that, depending on your temperament, is either a delightfully whimsical artistic achievement or an infuriatingly simplistic regression for a console that was supposed to be pioneering the third dimension. We're in that strange late 90s transitional period where everyone was waiting for the big, sprawling 3D adventures, yet here we have Takashi Tezuka essentially planting a flag for the 2D side-scroller, masquerading it as a storybook. It's a brave move, really, or perhaps a stubborn one, telling the hardware-hungry public that they didn't need depth. They just needed bright colors and, presumably, a soft place to land. Let's be honest about why this feature exists. At this point, the hunger for anything Nintendo was absolute. You were dealing with an imported N64 game that required a physical modification or an adapter to run on a PAL machine, meaning you'd likely pay through the nose to experience the joy of eating fruit in a papery, cut-out forest. For those of us who grew up on the precision-engineered difficulty of Yoshi's Island on the SNES, a game that genuinely tried to ruin your day with its relentless stage design, Yoshi's Story felt almost offensive in its malleability. The developers leaned so far into the kid-friendly aesthetic that they forgot to include anything resembling a challenge. The magazine does a decent job of framing the controversy. They rightly point out that while Tezuka-san was going for something intentionally simplistic, the gaming public, bless their ambitious little hearts, wanted more than a platformer you could polish off before finishing a bag of crisps. It is genuinely baffling, even looking back at it now. You have the Gen 64's horsepower, the silicon monster that gave us the sheer scope of Mario 64, and you're using it to power a game where you waddle left and right to feed a dinosaur some melons. The mechanics breakdown on the page highlights just how twee the whole ordeal is. The daisy petal health system? Honestly, it's a clever bit of U design. Essentially just an oversized heart meter. But it's framed as if it's the most revolutionary thing to hit gaming since the analog stick. It adds to the charm, sure, but charm only keeps you engaged for the first 15 minutes. By the 20th minute, you're searching for depth that simply isn't there. Is the game beautiful? Undeniably. The pre-rendered sprites and the pop-up book dioramas are visually delicious even today. They hold up significantly better than the jagged, low-poly early 3D efforts of the era. But it remains the classic curate's egg. It's gorgeous to look at and delightful for 5 minutes, but playing it long-term was akin to being force-fed candy floss. You appreciate the craftsmanship, the attention to the storybook, aesthetic, but when you're craving a main course, it's frustrating to be served nothing but the garnish. It's a classic case of the design team prioritizing feeling over actual substance, leaving us, the players, to sit there feeling both charmed and cheated in equal measure. It remains one of those strange, lovely little blips in the library that everyone respects, but perhaps nobody plays for long. Next we have a proper look at how this vibrant pop-up mess actually handles on the N64 controller. If the previous overview had us pondering the why of this artistic experiment, this double-page spread is strictly dedicated to the how. It's almost comical how the text breaks down these basic maneuvers, like you're piloting an F-18 fighter jet instead of a gluttonous green dinosaur who really likes fruit. Let's talk about the controls, shall we? You've got eating, where you hold down B to extend the tongue. It's a mechanic they want us to treat as a precision surgical strike, but let's be fair, you're mostly just hoovering up anything within arm's reach like a hyperactive toddler at a buffet. Then there's sniffing, which requires holding down R to zoom in. It's a terribly polite way of saying, look, the level is quite small. Using the N64's analog stick just to sniff at some digital scenery feels like a technological overcompensation really, especially when there's hardly any room to get lost. Then we have the combat maneuvers, described with all the gravity of a tactical combat sim. Power diving involves hitting a 2-jump and then smashing the analog stick down. The manual wants you to feel like you're performing a complex gymnastic feat, but let's be honest, you're just bouncing on the tops of bad guys until they turn into little stars. The text makes a massive song and dance about throwing eggs, treating the analog aiming crosshair like it's GoldenEye sniper precision. We all recall the reality: you'd often end up hitting absolutely everything except your intended target, getting mildly flustered and ultimately just eating the nearest melon instead, because the game is far too kind to let you actually fail. Look at the breakdown of the page 1 guide. You aren't just hitting checkpoints, you have to wake the slumbering continue points. Even the save game structure in this title refuses to be practical. It has to be cuddly and gentle. It highlights exactly what the consensus was back in 1998. This wasn't designed for the battle-hardened gamer raised on the punishing, pixel-perfect platforming of the previous generation. You're essentially taking a guided tour of a storybook that happens to move, rather than traversing a kingdom fraught with peril. Still, looking at those screenshots, the balloons, the thermal currents, the fluffy cloud sections, it's impossible not to appreciate the visual flair, even if your inner adrenaline junkie was screaming for something with a bit more grit. The magazine plays it straight, presenting this import arena feature like an essential manual for an intense, high-octane title. You have to admire the chutzpah required to frame a literal stroll through a colorful book as an epic adventure. It is a testament to how desperate we were to adore every single piece of silicon plugged into that N64 slot. We actually sat there reading detailed tutorials on how to duck, as if the local dinosaurs needed master-level training to avoid being mildly inconvenienced by a shy guy. Next we have the guide extending into the deep bowels of the subterranean depths, and then, shock horror, vaulting right back into the fluffy, overpolite skies of the 3rd level. The magazine approaches this with the solemn intensity of a military briefing, rather than what it truly is. A slightly distracted, perpetually hungry dinosaur taking a scenic stroll through a primary school craft project. Let's take a look at page 2, or as the article dramatizes it, underground. The tone implies grit, danger, and perhaps a boss battle that'll require every ounce of concentration you've got. In reality, we've got a 3-headed, fire-breathing skeleton dinosaur that you aren't even encouraged to fight. The text commands, with straight-faced gravity, that you simply jump over it. Groundbreaking strategy, really. Then we move on to pushing giant balls and hopping into propeller sources, with instructional text that sounds less like a game guide and more like a driving standards agency handbook. It's all a bit heavy-handed, isn't it? The writers make these pedestrian tasks sound like high-stakes infiltration missions, yet you're essentially just collecting fruit for your supper. Turning the page to the overground section, we're back in the ether. The overexcited prose details, riding skyworms, treating the simple act of hopping between floating loops as a complex aerial maneuver. I'm sure we all remember that specific type of concentration. It was less about tactical skill and more about just hoping the engine didn't decide to bug out while you were in mid-air. Then there's the breathless explanation about the pipes leading to fruit subgames. The editorial team truly drank the Kool-Aid here, painting the most routine, menial platforming actions as the height of gaming thrill. They treat the appearance of a standard caterpillar enemy, described with alarming wonder as a giant yellow centipede, like the arrival of a world-ending threat. The advice is so patronizing it borders on the charmingly archaic, telling us that yes, the blue blocks can be smashed with eggs. If you hadn't deduced that within about 30 seconds of holding the controller, you'd probably have struggled with turning the machine on in the first place. Let's be perfectly blunt. It encapsulates that desperate, gilded era of 1998, where every single release on the N64 was treated with such profound gravity, because we were collectively starved for new silicon. We were holding on to the console, praying for the next masterpiece, and we often forced ourselves to find brilliance in a gentle, linear storybook just to justify the investment. Reading these tips to keep your balance while aiming an egg really highlights how much we try to turn every standard platformer into an epic odyssey of endurance. It was a sweet little diversion, surely, but framed with this much grandeur, the article is absolutely hysterical. The next pages, page 4 and page 5, take us through the jungle and underwater environments, sections treated by our intrepid magazine scribes with the breathless importance of a surgeon performing a heart transplant. Reading this now, you get a genuine sense of the pressure journalists were under back in 98 to inject some drama into what is, let's be frank, the digital equivalent of a trip to a soft play center. The jungle section on page 4 kicks off with an absurdly serious query regarding inflatable PVC pillows, which looks exactly like the sort of pseudo-intellectual drivel we all fell for at the time. They're analyzing the scenery with such microscopic attention that you'd think the furniture held the secrets of the universe. Then we've got the tips on navigating spiders and melons, delivered with a stern tone that contradicts the visual feast of papercraft textures. There's a genuinely funny warning about a fat-lipped fish, representing instant death. It's hilarious because, in a game designed to be as unthreatening as a lukewarm cup of tea, this single gluttonous hazard feels almost vindictive, the game's singular, grumpy reminder that yes, you can fail if you're spectacularly careless. Moving over to the underwater section on page 5, the prose shifts gears from tactical expedition to something akin to a leisure center guide. The mention of the lack of an aqualung is particularly choice, given that a dinosaur wandering into the depths is already defying logic. But look at how they tackle the mechanics. It's all about the rhythm, the collect six-of-a-kind gameplay, and avoiding those persistent oysters. They really make managing your egg supply sound like high-level inventory management. What really stands out, with the benefit of hindsight, is the collective need to justify these mechanics. We were all staring at that screen in 1998, convincing ourselves that strategizing for fruit bonuses was a depth of gameplay that transcended the surface-level adorability. The editors weren't just writing a guide, they were padding out the experience, desperately trying to prove that this game wasn't just eye candy for the kiddies. It perfectly illustrates how we clung to every instruction as if it were unlocking hidden lore, rather than just pointing out which buttons to press to jump. It's charming, yes, but looking back at this relentless breakdown of such simple level design is a sobering reminder of how much effort we poured into convincing ourselves we were mastering an epic, when in reality, we were just guiding a very round dinosaur around a very, very colorful screen. Still, for an N64 title, you can't deny it had style. The next spread pulls us straight into the Technicolor fever dream that is Yoshi's story. Just looking at it, one has to wonder if Nintendo decided that we were all getting too stressed out with GoldenEye and needed a serious intervention in the form of crayons and paper cutouts. It is vibrant, it is bubbly, and frankly, it makes you question if the N64 suddenly morphed into an interactive pop-up book when we weren't looking. While we were clamoring for depth, grit, and 3D worlds that pushed the hardware to its absolute breaking point, Nintendo dropped this saccharine-sweet offering onto our consoles. The reviewer James Ashton isn't holding back, is he? And frankly, it is the correct stance to take. There is a palpable annoyance in the air here. We weren't investing our hard-earned pocket money to be patronized by talking dinosaurs and level designs that practically hold your hand across the finish line. Yoshi's story has a certain, peculiar aesthetic. The visuals are undoubtedly stunning, with that distinct handcrafted look. But underneath that polished surface lies gameplay that feels like it's being run in neutral. Take the gameplay mechanics. We are looking at collecting melons, tongue-flicking shy guys, and navigating stages that seem designed to never truly challenge you. The boss battles, particularly that bizarre creature resembling the Michelin Man, aren't so much trials of skill as they are awkward interruptions during your casual stroll through the level. It feels like the developers looked at Mario 64, decided that movement and momentum were too much for everyone, and hit the "No? Autopilot" button. The score given is an 86%, which feels rather generous, doesn't it? It's essentially a Nintendo tax. You get a high mark simply because it is beautiful, and works exactly as advertised, even if the as advertised bit is mind-numbingly simple. It isn't trying to change the gaming landscape, it's trying to be a pretty postcard. And don't get me wrong, it is pretty. It is arguably one of the most aesthetically pleasing titles on the system, like a picture book that happens to move. But beauty doesn't keep you awake at night with adrenaline, does it? If you are a collector, or simply have a burning desire to eat enough virtual melons to keep an army of Yoshis full for a century, then this might be your cup of tea. For the rest of us, waiting for something with real teeth, or at least a challenge that lasts longer than a bus ride, it is a charming but ultimately hollow diversion. A solid 2D platformer, sure, but in the era of GoldenEye and Mario 64, it feels like trying to bring a teddy bear to a tank battle. Cute, but clearly out of its depth. The next page brings us a reflective look at the Lizard King himself, Yoshi, trying to rebrand a career that has fluctuated wildly between being a high-precision 16-bit platforming legend and an educational, background-dwelling footnote. It is quite funny to see the magazine attempting to treat his history like some high-profile Hollywood biography. Let's be honest, tracking Yoshi's timeline highlights the jarring transition from his peak on the SNES, where Yoshi's Island stood as a monolithic, genre-defining masterpiece, to his rather desperate nomadic years where he showed up for a quick payday in titles like Mario is Missing. Surely we have all collectively agreed to suppress the memory of that geography travesty. Seeing him framed as Nintendo's most valuable player feels a bit hyperbolic when his initial N64 appearances were essentially cameo-heavy glorified background dressing. The text rightfully identifies Yoshi's Island as the gold standard, a high point so lofty it casts a shadow over his entire subsequent career. It serves as a stark reminder that while he had it, finding that lightning in a bottle again wasn't exactly going to be a walk in the park. Switching gears to the import arena sidebar, we find a curious attempt to corral various dinosaur-themed titles together. It's a bit of a grim display. The critique of Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, is sharp, pointing out that Acclaim clearly confused a simple kill anything with a tail objective for deep characterization. Anyone who spent more than an hour navigating that swampy landscape recalls the absurdity of the enemy AI. It wasn't so much Dinosaur Hunter as it was, wait for the reptile to glitch into a wall so you can save ammunition. Then we have Primal Rage. It tried to mask its clunky, rudimentary mechanics with a layer of gritty, aggressive gore, appealing to the younger audience that thought a T-Rex projectile vomiting made a game edgy. In reality, it was as deep as a puddle. The commentary here is quite damning, pointing out that the spectacle was all the game had going for it. It really illustrates the desperation to make fighting games happen on the hardware when better alternatives existed. And spare a thought for Jurassic Park on the SNES. It is the textbook definition of a licensed project built for a quick cash grab, capitalizing on the cinematic fervor without any real care for how a game should actually function. It belongs in the bin of history alongside other ambitious but deeply misguided tie-ins. Thankfully, the page saves its limited praise for Diddy Kong Racing. Rare had a knack for showing everyone else how it should be done, while the other titles here fumbled about, trying to justify their existence through shock value or low-effort brand usage. Diddy Kong Racing took the prehistoric aesthetic and actually built a genuinely cohesive, enjoyable experience around it. It is arguably the only dinosaur-adjacent title on this spread that respects the player's intelligence and time. The import arena essentially serves as a graveyard for bad dino gaming, with one sole survivor standing proud amongst the rubble. It's a ruthless assessment, but absolutely fair given the DROS developers were throwing at the dinosaur trope during that period. Next we have a sharp left turn from the prehistoric stomping grounds of the previous page, shifting from ancient extinction events to the digital survival of colorful, round creatures. We find ourselves in the import arena again, staring down the barrel of Tamagotchi World 64. You know the drill by now. Those digital keyring pets were seemingly unavoidable in the late 90s, demanding just enough attention to be a pest, but never quite enough to earn any real respect. Transforming that entire phenomenon into a sprawling N64 board game is exactly the sort of eccentric, left-field experiment that made tracking down import titles a glorious hit-or-miss lottery. The write-up here plays it with delightful detachment, framing the review like a tuxedoed agent at a high-stakes baccarat table, pondering whether to bet it all on a virtual board game involving squishy blobs. It is almost mocking, the way the reviewer applies such cinematic gravity to a title that is essentially a computerized game of chutes and ladders. But if you peer past the humor, the critique lands on a sentiment anyone who spent their formative gaming afternoons playing budget party software will recognize instantly. It isn't just about entertainment, it's an exercise in sheer endurance. Structurally, the title is a 4-player slog across 4 generations of blob development. The magazine correctly identifies that while the visual style is gleeful, drenched in the kind of saccharine, colorful polish you'd expect, the actual core loops rely far too heavily on the school of design that essentially mandates mashing the A button until your thumb gives out. We are talking about rudimentary reflex tests, sub-games that function less like puzzles or skill checks, and more like administrative chore lists. The reviewer is refreshingly candid about this reality. You aren't so much playing a masterpiece of engineering, as you are entering a war of attrition with a demanding, digital brat. The AIO, apparently, is entirely determined to drive you to the brink of insanity, wasting your hard-earned energy just as you think you've snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. It's genuinely entertaining to read a critique that essentially admits to losing several hours of their life to this digital slog, despite harboring a simmering resentment for the time lost. The board game mechanics feel less like high-stakes competition and more like waiting for a cross-country bus in the pouring rain. Ultimately, the piece captures a definitive truth about the N64 library in the late 90s. Occasionally, you needed titles that were colorful and accessible enough to drag your mates away from, or perhaps take a break from, the relentless tension of competitive shooters. The magazine classifies it as an acceptable party title, which is often code for mindless fluff to play while consuming tea and biscuits. Scoring it at 79%, the critique lands right in the sweet spot of British mediocrity, perfectly serviceable, visually inoffensive, and ideal for a lazy weekend, provided you don't demand any intellectual substance. It's perfectly fine filler, assuming you have the patience for it. This next double-page spread dumps us right into the messy, bewildering world of the import arena, where, in the late 90s, you'd often drop a significant portion of your hard-earned wages on a Japanese import, heart fluttering with hope, only to find yourself holding a piece of absolute plastic junk. It was the quintessential gamer's gambling on a glossy box featuring colorful, aggressive figures and text we couldn't decipher, inevitably hoping for a hidden gem and often coming away with a dull, incomprehensible mess. On the left we have the dubious pleasure of Duel Heroes, a fighting title that seemingly mistook dull for a gameplay feature. Seeing a review slap a 28% on the hood is frankly poetic. There's something undeniably funny about a reviewer being this genuinely annoyed by a title. The consensus is clear. If you wanted to watch clunky, polygon-heavy mannequins waddle around in a repetitive brawl, then sure, fill your boots. But for anyone looking for the finesse and speed that Killer Instinct, or even the better tier of brawlers offered, this was essentially a masterclass in frustration. The reviewer highlights how every character seemingly suffers from the same repetitive moveset, and that annoying delay between tapping the controller and seeing the action on screen. It really captured that feeling of regret when you finally realize you've bought a total stinker. Then we drift over to the right-hand side for Token Road, yet another wrestling attempt to fill the void. The Japanese obsession with dramatic, masked wrestlers is well documented, and for those who had any sense, the genre was already being well fed by the superior, high-octane delights of WCW/NWO World Tour. This, however, was an attempt to take that spotlight with entirely fictional, generic characters that lacked any of the punch or personality you'd want from the squared circle. It's essentially the budget alternative, the We Have Wrestling at Home version of a game. While it scrapes a slightly less depressing score than Duel Heroes, at 49%, the criticism rings true. It's visually loud and filled with colorful characters, but it lacks the soul and refined mechanics needed to make it anything more than a fleeting distraction for anyone not entirely obsessed with virtual spandex-wearing giants. Both these reviews really epitomize the mid-90s approach to imports. Everything had to be high impact, bright, and brimming with digitized graphics, yet underneath the surface, these games often lacked the polish that defined the true titans of the console. They represent the what-if side of N64, collecting the titles we spent ages reading about, hoping they were groundbreaking, only to find out they were largely, well, completely underwhelming fluff. Sometimes, it's not just the classics that define an era, but the dross that reminded us exactly how good the real blockbusters actually were, when we finally managed to tear ourselves away from the bins of cheap import disappointments. The next page provides a much-needed redemption arc for the import arena section, proving that not every trip to the grey import counter of your local gaming store resulted in a session of deep regret. We finally pivot away from the clunky, uninspired disasters often found in these imports and onto Snowbow Kids, a title that frankly shouldn't have been as addictive as it clearly was. Let's face it, if you spent your late 90s obsessed with the perfect arcade racer, your life undoubtedly revolved around Mario Kart 64. It was the absolute gold standard for friendship-ending multiplayer, and it cast a shadow so wide that almost every other similar title on the console struggled to crawl out from under it. Yet, here is Snowbow Kids, arriving with all the subtlety of a snowball to the face, daring to challenge that supremacy. It swaps the familiar tarmac and karts for treacherous mountain peaks, yet retains the only ingredient that actually matters: the capability to systematically dismantle your best friend's morale with a well-timed item. Looking back, it's refreshing to see a review that doesn't treat the reader like a numpty, clearly communicating why this title earned the prestigious Star Game stamp of approval. Unlike those sluggish, unresponsive disasters that usually left you crying into your wallet after spending too much on an import, Snowbo Kids controlled with absolute precision. That specific praise for the analog stick's performance isn't just filler. Responsiveness was essentially the dividing line between a decent session and pure, unbridled irritation when bombing down a slope with 3 other people jostling for the same line. The premise, children recklessly barreling down lethal inclines, is patently absurd, but it possessed that frantic, high-energy arcade pulse that the finest titles on the system nailed so effortlessly. The true meat of the experience isn't the racing, it's the sheer hostility. The red and blue power-up system effectively served as a guidebook on how to become the most hated person in your living room. Whether you're smacking opponents with frying pans, trapping them in giant snowmen that leave them helpless and waddling through the course, or deploying ghosts to harass the leader, the mechanics are gloriously mean-spirited. It wasn't about racing elegance, it was about weaponized frustration. The reviewer captures the misery of falling into last place quite well. Once you get battered by items early on, you're effectively committed to an humiliating, slow-paced scramble to climb back up the leaderboard, a detail that feels uniquely cruel but entirely in the spirit of the genre. In an era where you essentially gambled your life savings on whether an overseas title would actually function in English or remain a wall of text, Snowbo Kids felt like striking gold. It wasn't a cheap gimmick or a half-baked conversion. It was a tight, fast-paced, and genuinely challenging competitor. While it never managed to dethrone the king of kart racers in the long run, it served as a bloody fantastic alternative for those nights when the familiar loops of Luigi Raceway had gone stale, and you needed to introduce some genuine freezing mayhem into the fold. The next page dives deep into the specific locales and button mashing techniques required to actually stand a chance in Snowboard Kids. It serves as an essential manual for surviving the weirdly diverse landscapes that seem to have very little concern for meteorological consistency. You start on snowy mountain peaks, drift through pleasant fields of sunflowers, and inexplicably end up at a dinosaur-infested theme park. Logic was clearly not on the menu, just extreme sports and series of poor decisions. The track breakdown, branded with the high-concept title, Track Suite, treats these locales with a strange mix of mild reverence and dire warnings about your imminent failure. Taking a closer look at the Night Highway, entry advising that the darkness means you'll be off, is hardly a revelatory breakthrough, but that is precisely the kind of blunt, borderline useless advice we became accustomed to during an era where struggling meant you were simply failing to look at the screen properly. Then there is the character roster sidebar. One must appreciate the absolute savagery leveled at poor Tommy, described quite bluntly as fat boy, hopeless. It's refreshing to see the editorial team abandon all sense of professional neutrality in favor of shamelessly body-shaming digital children. Everyone recalls the unofficial rule set during those sessions. Picking Tommy wasn't an option, it was a fundamental character flaw. Choosing your rider in these titles was always the most tactical part of the pre-game lobby, separating the seasoned experts from those who simply picked whoever looked the funniest while eating it face first into a snowbank. The gameplay tips provided are where the edge of the board really hits the ice. Steering on the N64 was never quite as precise as the marketing claimed, and trying to finesse a heavy carving turn on a slope often felt akin to navigating a shopping trolley through an icy supermarket car park. The how-to guides actually strike at the heart of why we pulled our hair out, failing to master the specific finicky mechanics of board reverse and landing those sweet air tricks meant you were essentially cannon fodder for your friends. That frantic, sweating through your shirt desperation to bank cash mid-race just to afford a single, puny weapon was a unique kind of digital psychological warfare. The graphics featured here perfectly capture that distinct, angular charm of the late 90s. Watching the screen captures of Dino Park reinforces why we loved this sort of bizarre variety. Who needs simple snowbound runs when you can collide with an animated brontosaurus instead? It stands as a testament to the game's deceptive complexity, masking a punishingly difficult, cutthroat arcade racer underneath a colorful, kid-friendly aesthetic. If you were struggling to keep your dignity intact, this guide was the thin line between victory and being left in the snow by a better skilled mate. The next spread acts as a stark study in emotional variance, contrasting the sheer, unbridled glee of a surprise racing hit with the slow-burning misery of a classic arcade title being butchered by poor camera decisions. Regarding Snowboard Kids, the reception is delightfully positive. An 88% is not given out lightly to something that looks like it belongs on the lower shelves. The reviewers here clearly relished the way it gatecrashed the party, effectively spitting in the eye of expectations. It captures the unique absurdity of that specific era of N64 software, brightly colored, arguably too charming for its own good, but masking a devilishly addictive arcade engine that forced your heart rate through the roof on the final lap. Comparing it favorably against the absolute heavyweights of the console's library takes some stones, but for a title that people expected to vanish without a trace, it's a ringing endorsement. It's rare to find a game that doesn't just borrow mechanics from the big players, but manages to polish them into a genuine challenge. You recall how those races went. The rubber banding of the computer-controlled players was absolutely infuriating, and yet there you were, shouting at the television because you'd managed to throw your character into a snowy ravine again. Then there is the tonal whiplash when we hit Robotron 64. This is the classic 1998 gaming experience, trying to force an old-school arcade relic onto modern hardware and discovering the hard way that not everything ages with dignity. The verdict is predictably prickly. While it gets some points for the frenetic pace, the frustration is palpable in the text. Dealing with a fixed, static camera while you are being absolutely pelted by projectiles from beyond your field of view was a unique kind of punishment that we all learned to loathe. It touches upon a truth we all accepted at the time. We wanted the arcade experience at home, but we were often given flawed, squint-inducing ports that demanded a patience most of us lacked after a day at school. They point out that level 100 struggle, which sounds less like a game and more like a psychological endurance test. When you see a game receiving a 75% score despite these glowing design flaws, it really does tell the story of the day. There was a desperate hunger for new content, and sometimes you just had to make do with games that punished you for simply trying to play them. The next page presents us with an interesting relic, Art of Fighting Twin on the N64. After enduring the stiff-as-a-board fixed-camera nightmares of other, lesser arcade ports, this feels like an attempt at actual innovation, or at least a desperate effort to show us that yes, you can do fighting games on a cartridge without completely sacrificing your sanity. Culture Brain has never been one for doing things the conventional way. You remember their particular brand of weirdness, don't you? Well, here they are, shoving a fighter onto the N64, a console notoriously shy about hosting a decent scrap. It is a bit like turning up to a black tie gala in a scuba suit odd, but at least you have something to talk about. The reviewers seem strangely smitten, claiming it manages to combine the best parts of two very different beat-em-up subgenres. We are treated to two modes, a cartoony version that's meant for ease, and a more serious, grown-up experience. It is a classic split-personality performance, but for once, it doesn't leave you crying in the corner. There is a genuine, slightly impressed air around this review. They talk about staggering amounts of playability and, heavens forbid, actual depth. Considering we had all largely resigned ourselves to the absolute tragedy that was Street Fighter Alpha 64, a game that played like a slideshow running on half-dead batteries, this feels like a cool oasis in a desert. The inclusion of sidestepping in the more serious mode suggests that someone at Culture Brain actually paid attention to how 3D space functioned, unlike almost everyone else attempting to port fighting titles to the machine at the time. It is the ultimate import dream scenario. The graphics are quintessentially 1998 chunky, unashamedly polygonal, with flat, pre-rendered backdrops, but they hold their own in the charm department. You look at those screenshots, and you can almost feel the phantom weight of the grey controller in your palms, frantically attempting to memorize those complex button combos that require either a doctorate in Japanese kanji, or, more likely, a hell of a lot of trial and error. That 78% rating suggests a game that sits just above the line of mediocrity, the kind of thing you would only buy if you had exhausted Mario Kart track time and simply needed a way to batter a friend digitally. Does it shatter expectations? No. Does it occasionally punish you with insurmountable difficulty spikes? Absolutely. But the writers here clearly appreciate that for all its eccentric, quirky Japanese stylings, the game actually has a heartbeat. It is not just another soulless, watered-down port of an aging arcade classic. It is a strange, multifaceted, and remarkably functional bit of software that fills the yawning void in the N64's fighting library. It serves as a reminder that whilst the console was rightfully celebrated as the undisputed throne room for 3D platforming royalty, it was also capable of being a surprisingly competent home for a good scrap, provided you looked in the right, often foreign places. The next spread drops us smack into the import arena, a recurring fever dream that reminded us all that for every polished gem there was an equal and opposite force of sheer rubbish waiting across the ocean. Take a look at Aero Gauge on the left, a 10% rating. That is an absolute slaughterhouse of a review. The magazine isn't mincing words, calling it inconceivably vile, and a masterclass in how to implement the most abysmal pop-up geometry on the machine. We all remember those desperate weeks where we craved any futuristic racing game to tide us over, but this was essentially the equivalent of a cruel prank. It's a game that seemed to resent your existence, punishing the player with hideous frame rate hiccups and AI that behaved like it had been lobotomized before the race began. If you found yourself steering your ship into a wall because the level hadn't loaded in, well, that was just the aero gauge experience. It is honestly refreshing to see a game called out so aggressively. It was a waste of perfectly good cartridge space. Then, for something completely different, we have Denryu Irarabu from Hudson. It is quite literally the digital equivalent of that wire loop game we all had in the cupboard, the one that buzzed in your ear if you wobbled. Giving this a 65% is a rather generous pat on the head, but fair play for acknowledging the absurdity. It's essentially a high-tension twitch reflex test masquerading as a puzzle title, demanding more dexterity than the N64 controller, a plastic brick designed for clumsy hands, was ever comfortable providing. It carries that distinct, rigid Hudson quirkiness that was seemingly injected into every project they greenlit back in '98. It's essentially a case of extreme wire avoidance. Ooh, is it good? That's debatable. Is it going to skyrocket your blood pressure to dangerous levels? Absolutely. But compared to the dismal, hollow disaster that is aero gauge, navigating a pixelated line through a labyrinth almost starts to look like a stroke of genius. These pages are a reminder of why many of us started treating foreign game releases with a degree of healthy suspicion. It was a digital roulette, where most chambers contained nothing but crushing disappointment, obscure menu systems and a mild headache, while the winners, few and far between, offered just enough novelty to keep us feeding our imported consoles. The next double-page spread presents the holy grail for any self-respecting late 90s enthusiast: the dark, often expensive, art of the import scene. This guide is less of a hobbyist suggestion and more of a tactical briefing for the impatient gamer who couldn't bear to wait for Nintendo of Europe's glacially slow regional releases. You've likely seen this snapshot: a chap sitting on the floor surrounded by game boxes, desperately trying to translate kanji menu screens with a heavy, physical dictionary. That image perfectly captures the utter, bewildering madness we all embraced. If you weren't fluent in the nuances of menu navigation in a language you hadn't learned, you were basically playing a game of chance every time you booted up, often accidentally deleting your progress just because the menu yes and no were essentially the same squiggly line. Setting it all up was the real initiation ritual for the aspiring importer. We weren't just playing games, we were electrical engineers. It involved heavy-duty step-down transformers to prevent our domestic power grid from essentially barbecuing the internal components of a machine designed for Tokyo's voltages. You'd have a massive converter unit, tangled masses of S-video and SCART leads snake coiling into the back of your television, and a desperate prayer that the refresh rate conversion didn't crush your favorite title into a jittery, stuttering mess. Looking at the timeline provided in the chart, the waiting times between the Japanese or American launches and the UK releases are laughable in hindsight. Seeing the year-long gap for Super Mario 64 or a solid half-year wait for GoldenEye, it's a wonder we didn't just give up entirely. Why would anyone sit idle for 6 months when you could pay through the nose to import it early? It was a pride thing, obviously. In an era before the internet gave us instant gratification, possessing an NTSC copy of Lilac Wars or Blast Corps gave you local legend status among your circle of mates. Then there is the attention given to Yoshi's story. Even back then, there was something undeniably alluring about the imported packaging. Japanese publishers knew exactly how to make a shelf look impressive, with that distinctive papercraft aesthetic, which often put our boring, clinical, regional boxes to shame. The writer here wisely suggests that by late 1997 and early 1998, we were turning a corner. Publishers were beginning to realize that if they kept stalling, the die-hard market would simply jump ship and go elsewhere, and so the regional release gap started to narrow. It's a nostalgic nod to a time when your gaming library was a genuine international travel effort, rather than a download on a digital storefront. The next section of this guide essentially acts as a technical manual for the clinically insane, or rather the incredibly dedicated gamer who wanted to treat their console like a custom project car. The editors have essentially given us permission to go wild with a hacksaw, taking to the plastic housing of our precious consoles just to ensure a Japanese cartridge clicks in. You recall that look of dread on your own face when hovering a hacksaw over your perfectly working machine, all in the name of circumventing a bit of shaped plastic to gain access to, say, the imports that wouldn't arrive on our shores for another eternity. And then there's the electric situation. You cannot speak about 1998 imports without acknowledging the step-down transformer. These things were monstrous, humongous, and possessed the unfortunate habit of buzzing loudly while running hot enough to double as a radiator. We spent our teenage years sitting on the floor, wired into these fire hazards, clutching a controller, genuinely terrified the whole rig would pop if we left the console on for more than 3 hours of straight gaming. The highlight, though, is the brutal dissection provided in Tales of the CRT. It's an exercise in pure misery, proving precisely why we were all so disgruntled with our PAL standard televisions. Looking at those screenshots of Wave 64 or Blastcore is physically painful, even now. The NTSC side is vibrant, crisp, and filling the screen with joyous action. The UK comparison looks like it was captured through a thick, murky window with that egregious, inescapable black border and eyesore that defined European gaming in the late 90s. When you stack the UK version of Mario 64 next to the Japanese one, it really puts the situation in perspective. We weren't just playing smaller games, we were getting, effectively, less pixels per square inch of our lives. The sheer absurdity of the cabling setup cannot be ignored either. To get any decent fidelity out of this equipment, we became self-taught electrical engineers, managing a jungle of S-video, SCART, and phono leads that turned the living room into an R&D lab for high-end cabling. If you didn't have a floor filled with tangled leads looking like an abstract painting, you simply weren't doing it right. And heaven help the unsuspecting parent or sibling who dared cross that wire-riddled living room with a vacuum cleaner. It was a total disaster waiting to happen. Ultimately, it's an honest, slightly cynical take on the effort we exerted, and seeing those visual side-by-sides remains a stark reminder that if you weren't hacking your way through import hardware, you were objectively getting the short end of the stick. Next, we have an intimate peek into the clandestine world of late 90s console, importing a necessary evil if one preferred their gameplay crisp, unbordered, and occurring on time. The chaps at New Generation Consoles in Leeds and Game Freaks of Bristol essentially admit that their clientele were grown adults with enough disposable income to justify paying a premium to jump the queue. We really were a pathetic bunch of addicts, weren't we? Bribing grey market traders to source hardware just to experience the difference between a proper NTSC machine and the dreary, letterboxed output we were officially shackled with in the UK. It is rather funny seeing these interviews. There is an air of supreme legitimacy in their warehouse setups. They chat quite candidly about the shifting landscape. Yoshi's story is cited as a baseline for early sales, but then they pivot to the real meat of the matter: GoldenEye, Star Fox, and Cruisin' USA. These independent retailers were essentially curators of our digital salvation. They speak of an era where importing was synonymous with hardcore, even if half the challenge was just negotiating with customs and praying the parcel actually made it through. The consensus is telling. Manufacturers, bless their hearts, were simply not keeping up with global demands, creating that agonizing gap that pushed us all into the waiting arms of these boutiques. And how utterly classic is it that they mention being plagued by customers constantly demanding manga and anime imports on top of the consoles. Clearly, the UK appetite for Japanese content in Kada 98 was ravenous, yet the main retail channels treated us like we would be perfectly content playing whatever scraps were tossed our way months later. You see the mentions of Banjo-Kazooie being the next anticipated high seller. That captures the genuine thrill of the wait. We lived week to week on these importation updates, not because we were some sort of enthusiast nobility, but because we were fundamentally impatient creatures, desperate to squeeze every last frame of animation out of our silicon toys. These independent retailers were our lifelines, functioning not as massive corporate outlets, but as specialized depots for folks who simply refused to be left in the dust of regional licensing. It is an honest, slightly tragic look at how we treated a simple gaming console like an imported exotic vehicle. We poured excessive cash into this subculture, just for the privilege of experiencing exactly what our counterparts in Tokyo and California were getting out of the box, standard. A full-page advertisement for Total Film Magazine, flogging movie coverage from February 1998. It's quite the interruption, isn't it? Clearly desperate to grab the attention of gamers waiting for their latest release. The next page is a masterclass in handling a game that requires us to understand a sport where players take more breaks than they actually spend running around. It seems Max Everingham took the helm to guide us through the labyrinthine madness that is NFL Quarterback Club 98. It's a bold attempt to help the average Brit wrap their head around the American preoccupation with shoulder pads, excessive strategy meetings, and oddly shaped balls. Reading this advice, you can tell the author is working under the assumption that we're all completely mystified by what's happening on the screen. There's a certain grim determination in the way it's laid out, as if we're attempting to crack an Enigma code just to move the pigskin down the field. The overarching theme here isn't just about gameplay mechanics, it's about giving the Yanks a thrashing. Which, let's be honest, is probably the only reason most of us were curious about these titles in the first place. Who wouldn't want to see a virtual quarterback run through a series of tactical decisions that would make a chess master sweat? The instructions themselves are endearingly basic. The tip to essentially do nothing when faced with a complex defensive setup is a stroke of accidental genius. It speaks volumes about the early, awkward phase of sports sims, where the AI was more likely to trip over its own shoelaces than present a coherent strategy. There's a beautiful irony in needing a written guide to avoid clumping up like a pile of panicked pills, when what you really want is a clear path to a touchdown. Of course, the whole affair is treated with that classic, begrudging 1998 British journalism charm. There's a distinct air of superiority regarding the sport itself, masking the fact that Quarterback Club was a highly detailed simulation, arguably miles ahead in terms of graphics and technical fidelity for the era. The magazine treats us like we are intellectual giants venturing into a playground designed by committee, where throwing a ball is treated with the same weight as planning a moon landing. It perfectly captures that weird fleeting time in the N64's life cycle, where we were essentially playing exotic imported simulations just to see if the hardware could pull them off. Did we care about the intricacies of the defensive formations? Unlikely. We just wanted to see the grass textures, the physics, and the sheer audacity of a game that took itself far more seriously than we did. Even if we didn't know our wide receivers from our tight ends, we surely enjoyed the challenge of pretending we did while trying to rack up points against a CPU that was likely designed to ruin our entire weekend. It's charming, honestly. A relic of an age where we'd force ourselves to enjoy anything just because the N64 rendered it with that delicious, fog-filled clarity we couldn't get anywhere else. This page acts as the definitive roadmap for those poor, lost souls trying to grapple with the baffling, hyper-technical minutiae of NFL Quarterback Club 98. It is all here. The desperate, intricate dance of play-calling that tries so very hard to justify the controller's existence, transforming what could be a bit of fun into something resembling a tactical exam. The section dedicated to defense is charmingly futile. The suggestion that we are supposed to intelligently read the opponent's formation before mashing buttons in a panic praying for an interception highlights exactly how inaccessible these imported American sports simulations were to the average British teen. We wanted explosions. We wanted high-speed racing, not a geometry lesson involving men in padding running into each other while we stare blankly at the screen. Then we have the offensive plays, broken down by yardage with the kind of academic rigor usually reserved for medical degrees. The specific advice on formations from the pro set for short gains to the run and shoot for the glory of a 30-yard completion reads like a classified military telegram. One can almost picture a bedroom strewn with empty crisp packets, someone frantically flipping through these magazine pages just to successfully execute a 5-yard run without throwing the ball straight into the arms of the opposition. It's a wonderfully high-effort manual for a low-patience audience who probably just wanted to see if they could make the console do something clever. The layout itself is practically clinical, a masterclass in making a sport look like tax auditing. There is an irony, surely, in seeing such a comprehensive, dense guide printed for a sport that mostly relies on smashing into the opposition. But this was 1998. The N64 didn't just display games, it promised simulated reality, and magazines felt duty-bound to help us pass the complex, impenetrable interfaces of these exotic imports. It's a testament to the console's perceived potential that we cared enough to print full-page, multi-step breakdowns for something as esoteric as proper punting etiquette, or deciding between a wing T med post and Pro Set 89 hooks. Perhaps the most honest piece of advice on the entire spread sits tucked away under sound. It suggests, quite bluntly, that you simply turn Marv off. Finally, a piece of gaming wisdom everyone can agree on. Whether you found the incessant play-by-play commentary from Marv Albert utterly insufferable or you just wanted to drown out the tedium with a bit of decent music, it's a refreshing moment of clarity in a sea of confusing tactical diagrams. Even if you didn't play for longer than a Sunday afternoon, for those few hours, you were supposedly a master coach of the gridiron, purely because you had the right instructions in hand. It's glorious in its commitment to being a chore disguised as a hobby. This next part of the page basically scrapes the bottom of the barrel to keep you interested in this gridiron spreadsheet simulation. The guide suggests we meticulously analyze the opposition's formation. As if any of us weren't just sitting on the floor praying that mashing the A button would result in a touchdown. It is an adorable effort to elevate the experience from frantic button mashing to actual tactical genius. The text practically begs you to use the slow-mo replay function, presumably so you can study the exact frame where your master plan disintegrated into a humiliating fumble. They even instruct on how to pull off a fake field goal, assuming the player possesses the icy nerves to time a hit under pressure, rather than screaming in terror at the impending sack. It treats every player error as a brilliant strategic failing rather than the result of a controller layout that was never built for complex American football strategies. Honestly, attempting to distinguish between a dime or goal line defense on a low-resolution screen was, and remains, an exercise in futility. It is peak 1998 ambition, dressing up digital drudgery as an intellectual sport. Finally, we have a blatant advertisement for Total Football Magazine, featuring a very serious Alan Shearer attempting to coerce you into a 3-issue subscription for £5. The next page dives headfirst into Extreme G, the quintessential, I hope my retinas can actually process this level of motion blur racer that defined the mid-era N64 lifespan. It remains the gold standard for games that desperately wanted to be taken seriously as ultra-futuristic simulations, whilst simultaneously operating on a track layout logic that assumed you were perfectly happy to bounce off the walls like an exuberant rubber ball. The feature spends a decent amount of time framing the no-crash mechanics as a brilliant design choice rather than an admission that nobody wanted to play a game where a single mistimed jump reset your race in the first 10 seconds. They refer to this as an asphalt ballet, which is undoubtedly a grandiose bit of journalism for what effectively boils down to rubbing against a transparent wall until you find your grip. Let's be fair, if we couldn't slam into the track borders at max speed without exploding into a pile of bits, most of us wouldn't have completed a single circuit. It removed the skill gap of accurate cornering and replaced it with a test of rhythm and pure, unadulterated reaction speed. It's genuinely hilarious to see the guide talk about handling the finer points of cyberbike physics, when, in reality, most of us were white-knuckling the controller and treating the shoulder button power slide as a divine intervention. If you weren't smashing those triggers to initiate a slide the second you saw a curve approaching, you were effectively a stationary object waiting to be rear-ended by your own inadequacy. It was a game about momentum above all else. If you stopped for even a millisecond, the illusion of high-speed technical driving dissolved entirely, and you were just left driving a sad floating plastic rectangle around a sterile tunnel. Those nitrating boosts, of course, were the primary cause of every swear word uttered in gaming living rooms throughout 1998. It was the hope I don't lose control button. One press and you were off, often clipping the track geometry at such an oblique angle that the bike seemed to vibrate into another dimension. As for the cheat section, back then you had to scribble these down with a pen and paper. No instant menus or menu options, just long, tedious passwords. We actually worked for our extra lives and bizarre graphical filters. Comparing that era to modern games where you just pay a pittance to unlock things, it's refreshing to think we earned our invincibility through good old-fashioned brute force. Ultimately, this page reminds us that Extreme G wasn't ever aiming for reality. It was aiming to make us feel like we were moving at warp speed. And despite the questionable barrier bouncing mechanics, it usually managed to pull it off. Just don't ask about the turn radius, unless you wanted to see someone rage quit into the middle of the following week. This page brings us down to the nitty-gritty of selecting your rocket-powered death trap. It's a roster of machines that honestly look more like a collection of abstract kitchen appliances glued together and shoved onto a track than anything resembling a futuristic race vehicle. You've got to admire the effort here. Listing specific unique weapon loads like pulse cannon or Excel cannon implies there's some tactical nuance to be found, but let's be entirely honest with ourselves. Picking your bike was rarely about weapon efficiency, and almost always about which one looked least likely to fly off the side of the map at the first sign of a bump. Take the Apollyon, for instance. The text talks about it being for the bloodthirsty. In reality, choosing it was often a fast track to smashing your front forks into a metallic divider, leaving you to admire the beautiful, jagged textures of the wall at warp speed. Then you've got Rays, described as having an awful rate of acceleration. If there's one thing a game about going fast should avoid, it's being puzzlingly slow at the start. That's not a racing design. That's just rude. The section tries to give us the impression of balance with the other bikes, but honestly, you just had to endure the middle-of-the-road machines like the Mame or the Jolt until you realized the real secret was hidden under the hood. There's a certain tragic humor in how they describe the Muga as a redoubtable workhorse, simply because it has good shields. Of course it has good shields. You'll be scraping against every inch of the track with that lack of acceleration, so you effectively need them just to survive the embarrassing crawl to the finish line. If you picked the Muga, you were accepting your fate as the safe, plodding participant in a high-octane demolition derby. Then there's the lure of the secret bikes, the Roach and the Neon. Getting these was the badge of honor that separated the mere casual players from those of us who had spent our weekends properly obsessing over the game. The Neon? Well, looking at its sleek design compared to the chunky, angular nightmare that is the Roach, it was clearly the piece of kit you craved. If you managed to unlock that, the game suddenly shifted from a tense, wall-grinding test of patience to a complete walk in the park. Seeing a human opponent pull up in a Neon bike during split screen was essentially a prompt to put your controller down and make a brew. You knew the race was over before the green light even flickered. It's quaint, really, reading these descriptions with a decade plus of perspective. They really wanted us to believe this was a technical sim where you carefully balanced your bike's attributes. In truth, it was a test of raw reaction time and sheer stubbornness, where bike choice was mostly about aesthetics, except for when it was about finding that one overpowered hidden unlock that broke the game wide open. Truly, an era of bizarre vehicular design and optimistic stats. The next page opens with the rather sharp observation that violence didn't solve anything, accompanied by a spectacularly irreverent joke comparing the Gulf War to a game of Jenga. It is absolutely quintessential 90s gaming journalism, blithely suggesting international geopolitical strife could be solved with wooden blocks, all just to set the stage for why we're bolting cannons onto futuristic motorcycles. You've got to admire the confidence. They weren't exactly mincing their words back then. As for the kit list provided, the designers clearly had a more is more philosophy regarding hardware. We are talking about a catalogue of armaments that feels less like a racing title and more like an interplanetary arms trade gone wrong. They highlight weapons ranging from standard fare like missiles and flares to truly bizarre tactical inclusions. Who exactly came up with the TY, Wally Warp? A portable black hole for a motorcycle game seems like massive overkill. But then again, in a race where you're traveling at speeds that would make an aeroplane feel lethargic, you'll take whatever advantage you can grab. Using a Morningstar flail on a high-tech track is exactly the kind of unhinged, creative liberty that made games of this generation stick in the memory. It's less about refined combat and more about spraying energy around and hoping you hit the poor sod in front of you. The default cannons mentioned are standard fodder, though labeling the pulse cannon as pretty useless is the sort of brutally honest appraisal we loved. There's no sugarcoating for the reader there. If your primary gun is a damp squib, the writer makes sure you know to upgrade or stop complaining about finishing in 8th place. Looking at the right-hand column, there is a clear defensive posture taken against the titans of the N64 racing world. Mentioning Mario Kart 64 and Diddy Kong Racing is always a bold move, akin to bringing a pocket knife to a gunfight. They are desperately trying to convince us that Extreme G has enough content to stand toe-to-toe with those heavy hitters. They bang on about the quantity of tracks and the 4 battle arenas, as if to reassure anyone who just blew their hard-earned allowance money that this wasn't just a weekend fling. It's funny reading it now. We all knew deep down that Mario Kart reigned supreme in the living room, but that doesn't mean we didn't spend hours trying to master these tracks, cursing under our breath every time a rear-mounted missile knocked us off a boost pad. It's all part of the theater, isn't it? Convincing yourself that the game you just bought is the best decision you've made all year, even when the rival in the split-screen session has clearly mastered the art of shield recharging way better than you have. The next page dives headfirst into the digital gladiatorial arena that defined every sleepover in the late 90s, the deathmatch mode of GoldenEye 007. It is essentially a guide on how to be an absolute menace to your friends, which is the only real way to play, let's be honest. The tips regarding character height are particularly illuminating for those of us who spent half our formative years getting humiliated by anyone small enough to duck under a pistol shot. Let's be frank, telling players to choose a scientist because they're smaller than a skyscraper is less of a pro tip and more of a life lesson in underhanded survival tactics. The analysis of Jaws is spot on, picking that hulking behemoth is just asking to be the primary target for everyone's proximity mines, simply because you're essentially a stationary landmark. It is wonderful that the writers address this. There was no shame in gaming in the 90s. If the hitbox is smaller, you pick it. End of story. It wasn't about aesthetics, or being a dapper Bond villain. It was about squeezing out a single advantage to avoid the collective groans of the sofa-dwelling jury. Then there is the matter of the doors. We all remember the absolute high-tension frustration of frantically hitting the button to shut a door in a mate's face while they were hot on your heels. It's funny reading it now, but at the time, that microsecond delay while waiting for the game to register the interaction felt like an eternity. And using the environment to your advantage. Yes, it's standard stuff now, but for a title released back in the day, that level of interplay felt like revolutionary tactical genius. Throwing a mine, closing a door, and waiting for the telltale thud of your opponent's impending doom remains a masterclass in petty gaming warfare. The section on aiming serves as a polite reminder that our current reliance on dual-stick control schemes came at a cost. The precision required for manually targeting with the C buttons or the analog stick back then took the steady hands of a bomb disposal expert. Even the advice about the slap function is perfectly judged. Nothing quite cuts your pride to the quick like getting smacked down in an assassination scenario. As for the help wanted box tucked away on the left, it's a lovely bit of period-accurate fluff. N64 Magazine really managed to cultivate this atmosphere of shared endeavor, essentially convincing readers they were staff in training, just by begging them for tips in exchange for a branded jacket. We were all convinced our strats were groundbreaking, writing letters to the editors detailing where we hid mines as if it were a high-stakes military manual, rather than a slightly laggy game of four-player tag in a virtual facility. Ultimately, these guides were a sanity saver. Before you could hop online and look up a build or a path, you relied on this paper gospel. Looking at it now, the instructions are surprisingly clinical, devoid of fluff, focusing purely on survival, thievery, and efficient aggression. It captures exactly why this title had us by the throat for years. It was perfectly, maddeningly addictive. This page essentially serves as the arms dealer's handbook for aspiring virtual assassins, breaking down the arsenal in a way that suggests there was a proper, systematic curriculum for being an absolute pain in the neck to your mates. It is fascinating how the magazine breaks these weapons down, looking past the endless repetitive lines of hit statistics, which, let's be honest, nobody ever really sat there crunching before a match. The briefing notes tell a real story about the weapon hierarchy. You start with the Dostovoy, the trusty, reliable pistol that kept your pride intact before you nabbed the bigger toys. Then you have the Magnum, which felt about as hefty as it looked, providing that punchy, visceral feedback we were all so obsessed with in the late 90s. But the real joy is the candid assessment of the club. You have to appreciate the brutal honesty here, identifying it as the rubbish, weak-sauce pea shooter, that it serves as a harsh reality check for any budding player foolish enough to rely on it. It truly was an airsoft toy brought into a lethal war zone. And the RCP-90? That was effectively a cheat code with a high firing rate if you were lucky enough to scoop it up first. We cannot overlook the humble slap, either the most ignoble, pathetic way to go, designed entirely to bruise egos rather than meaningfully damage health bars. The second half of the spread shifts focus to the levels themselves, providing terrain reports for these theaters of operation. If these maps had distinct personalities, hostile is putting it mildly. Reading the tips for the temple is a lovely reminder of why proximity mines were eventually outlawed by the gentlemen's agreements that popped up in living rooms across the nation. Not that such social contracts ever stopped us from plastering the doorways with them anyway. That gaping hole in the center of the level wasn't just architecture, it was the world's most predictable, yet deeply satisfying, death trap. The guides for the facility bring up immediate, visceral memories of high-stress gameplay. If you weren't lurking in the vents or cowering in a toilet stall with a grenade launcher pointed firmly at the only entrance, were you even really playing GoldenEye? These environments weren't just low-res polygons. They were tight, claustrophobic arenas, where the geometry was your best ally and your worst nightmare. Sticking to the corridors in the stack wasn't merely a tactical decision. It was about the fear of being annihilated by some bloke, waiting patiently in the dark for the golden gun to respawn. It is a brilliant slice of documentation, capturing an era where we memorized these digital halls like infantrymen prepping for an offensive, rather than just four lads fighting over who gets the better seat on the sofa. The next page continues our descent into digital tactical operations, presenting further survival strategies for GoldenEye 007, because playing without a written guide was simply admitting defeat before you'd even plugged the controller in. We all remember clutching these pages like sacred scripture, while huddled around a flickering CRT, trying to map out levels that seemed specifically designed to frustrate. The bunker remains a level where wandering aimlessly inevitably leads to being shredded by a turret. The suggestion to hug the corridors is sensible, mainly because the alternative is standing in an open room acting as a stationary target. We've all been caught there dithering about in the open while those bloody fixed cameras pick us off with embarrassing accuracy. It was never about tactical brilliance. It was about knowing the route well enough to reach the weapon stash without dying twice before the mission truly began. Then we have the caverns. What an absolute shambles that map could be for anyone lacking a GPS. It was essentially a dark, maze-like death trap where creeping along the perimeter was the only way to avoid stumbling into an immediate demise. It felt like you were perpetually stalking someone, or, more likely, being stalked by a mate hiding behind a door with a remote mine. The archives level was a different kind of claustrophobic torture, particularly for anyone foolish enough to try it on 0 agent difficulty. Tucked into those cramped rooms, desperately hoarding any bit of body armor or ordnance we could find, we played less like special agents, and more like terrified occupants of a cell. It was always a high-tension scrap, and despite the fancy guide telling us how to be cunning, most of our time was spent frantically spinning around, after hearing the telltale thud of incoming grenades. And finally, there is the Aztec level, the elite's playground, or at least, the one you bragged about reaching after finishing the campaign. The magazine calls it cunning, but let's be honest, it was just an unforgiving sniping gallery. It was the game's way of forcing you to use those fiddly manual zoom controls, while praying your shaky thumbs wouldn't cost you a pixel-perfect shot. If you actually pulled off a clean round on Aztec, you felt like a genius. Usually, however, you were just cannon fodder for the enemy's superior vision. As for the side panel advert from Software First, it's a typical catalogue of games and accessories designed to extract every last penny of our paper-round money, with the usual scattergun approach to pricing that defined the era. The next page is your manual for navigating the fine art of not crashing into walls, serving up the essentials for Diddy Kong Racing, and mining a few extra secrets out of the other titles currently cluttering up the living room carpet. Diddy Kong Racing was Rare's answer to the kart racing obsession that had well and truly taken hold. While Mario Kart 64 was often the party piece for casual sessions, Diddy was the deeper, moodier brother that required you to actually learn how to race. The guide focuses on the nitty-gritty of power drifting, that bounce-turn mechanic that made you look like a rally driver until you caught the curb and went flying. Unlocking T.T, the stopwatch character, was the ultimate test of resolve. If you didn't have your hands shaking by the end of those time trials, you simply weren't doing it right. And the Kevin Bacon reference? Peak mid-90s writing. We weren't complaining then, were we? As for the readers, submissions, it's a standard mix of genius exploits, and the kind of things everyone claimed they totally figured out by themselves. The Mario Kart 64 Choco Mountain shortcut was one of those legendary maneuvers that made you feel like you'd just broken the laws of physics. Similarly, Shadows of the Empire makes an appearance. Let's be honest, it was clunky, and the control stick fighting with that wumper was essentially a test of your thumb's structural integrity, but it was Star Wars, so we swallowed the flaws. Then we have GoldenEye 007, the perennial gift that kept on giving, exploiting Dr. Dolk to essentially play the game for you in the facility level captures, that obsessive drive we all had to dismantle Rare's masterpiece bit by bit. Finally, Lilat War's absolute gold. Trying to nab the play as James McLeod medal wasn't just a fun weekend activity, it was a mission of national importance for anyone with a rumble pack and too much spare time. It's comforting to know that whilst the games are now dusty relics, these little cheats remain burned into the collective memory. Most of these tips would have made you a king of the playground, at least until your best mate bought the exact same magazine and realized you'd been stealing their secrets. The next page serves as the quintessential early N64 frustration mitigation unit, otherwise known as the Nintendo Hotline. Back in '98, before the internet was a constant companion in your pocket, calling a premium rate phone number for gaming help was the closest we got to having an omnipotent digital oracle. 50p a minute was practically a mortgage payment in playground currency, yet the desperate need to solve a puzzle often outweighed the terrifying prospect of opening a telephone bill. Beyond the advertisement for emptying your bank account, we get into the nitty-gritty of Bomberman 64. That game was, for lack of a better description, a geometric nightmare that demanded the spatial awareness of a master architect. This guide attempts to turn simple demolition into an advanced construction project, basically teaching you how to use explosives as stepping stones to reach heights you weren't meant to scale. If you actually managed to stack those bombs into a staircase without turning yourself into, well, nothing, you'd arguably be ready for a career in civil engineering. Moving swiftly to the more violent end of the spectrum, we have Duke Nukem 64. Note the charming screenshot of the lard character. It's the pinnacle of 90s tough guy bravado, featuring a pig cop who looks like he's having a total identity crisis. The provided codes are explicitly for those players who have reached the end of their patience with actual skill-based progression. Why bother searching for ammo when you can just punch in a string of buttons and become an unstoppable, walking, weapon-laden tank? Duke Nukem had a distinct flavor of gritty desperation when crammed onto the N64, but honestly, skipping the slog and going straight to the chaos was arguably the best way to enjoy it anyway. Rounding out the page is a dash of Extreme G. It was the game that promised us hypersonic speeds, Yet these codes essentially allow you to treat the screen like an amateur camera crew, tinkering with angles and zoom levels to make the experience bearable. It's a classic sign of the era. If the developers didn't give you the perfect view, they at least had the foresight to include a code to fix their mistake. It's a useful collection of cheats, provided you didn't accidentally blow your weekly allowance on the phone bill trying to learn how to walk up a wall in Bomberman. The next page presents the I'm the best feature, a shrine for those who found normal completionism far too simple. There's a bizarre, technically gifted tip for levitating the Dianoga in Shadows of the Empire, providing definitive proof that players were already finding weird ways to break the scenery back in 98. Following that, we're treated to reams of high-score tables for GoldenEye 007, Super Mario 64, and Wave Race 64. Honestly, the sheer level of dedication required to meticulously document accuracy percentages or race times for the glory of a magazine print is nothing short of heroic, if not slightly deranged. The next page carries on the tedious high-score ritual, detailing Mario Kart 64, Turok, and Star Fox times. Honestly, the dedication required for pixel-perfect driving and documenting it all just to beat some lad from Lincoln is impressively committed, if a bit deranged. It seems, 98 was prime time for shaving milliseconds off a lap, solely for the glory of seeing your name in black and white. The opposing page is merely an advert for T3 Magazine, showcasing overpriced camcorders and future tech for people who desperately need a expensive hobby. Skip it. The next page is a beautiful artifact of 1998, a time when the letters section served as the unofficial battleground for players, pedants, and armchair developers. We have here the typical cocktail of legitimate complaints, misguided design suggestions, and readers who clearly have way too much time on their hands. It starts with the standard gripe about Wave Race 64, with some brave soul moaning about the graphics degrading in two-player mode. The editors handle it with the usual dose of cynical wisdom, correctly reminding the lad that you have to pay a price to maintain that frame rate, without the hardware spontaneously combusting. There is nothing more British than arguing about water reflection rendering in the late 90s. Then there is the persistent, grating posturing about GoldenEye. Apparently, every adolescent in the UK breezed through zero-agent difficulty over a weekend. You've got the editors rightfully cutting these show-offs down to size, which remains the highlight of this entire page. They also managed to weave in Banjo-Kazooie discussions, proving that the collective obsession with the Bear-Bird duo had truly hit fever pitch months before its full arrival. The Dream On section really takes the biscuit though. I am sure we all remember when the public genuinely thought sending in game ideas like Snooker 64 or Sharp 64 would pique Nintendo's interest. It is a fantastic peek into the bizarre intersection of local TV obsessions and early 3D platforming ideas. The highlight, however, has to be the reader obsessing over the leftover code in a random briefcase texture in GoldenEye. It really highlights that we weren't just playing games back then, we were dismantling them, trying to find secrets hidden by developers who had no idea we were watching their every asset. Classic stuff. Next we have this absolute treasure trove of reader engagement. Let's be honest, the letters pages were 10% genuine questions and 90% readers justifying their questionable technical habits to editors who clearly preferred gaming to answering trivial inquiries. We have poor Danny, who is genuinely concerned his N64 is an outcast because of a missing logo. It's plastic and silicon, mate, not a teenager trying to fit in. Then there's Dave, whose solution to fitting the jumper pack, some enthusiastic butchery with a pair of household shears, perfectly illustrates the diddy recklessness of the late 90s. We all knew a kid like that, and we all prayed they wouldn't come near our consoles with sharp objects. The Invention Corner is another highlight, featuring a homemade attempt to jury-rig a camera setup onto the controller. Because that iconic three-pronged monstrosity wasn't awkward enough already, some genius thought it needed more peripherals attached to it. And the So Tell Me This section remains a goldmine of desperation. It captures the frantic energy of a player base dying for Japanese imports and obscure updates, with people asking for tips that probably wouldn't help their hopeless multiplayer performance in Mario Kart. It is fascinating to see the level of commitment hunting down import copies of games like Star Fox 64 under the guise of Lilac Wars, long before the rest of the world caught on. The remaining panels are simply full of grey importers trying to tempt you with expensive, Japanese exclusive titles, ensuring you stay broke while having the best import library in your neighborhood. This ad is peddling a subscription, dangling a cheap as chips, Trident, controller as bait. Get your checkbook out if you really fancy those back issues, but manage your expectations. The next page treats us to the comprehensive N64 directory, a proper roadmap for anyone trying to navigate the initial rush of the early library. It's an essential snapshot of how the industry was viewing the machine's first heavy hitters and more questionable missteps. It's a handy list, though peering through these reviews, one can't help but chuckle at the sheer brutal honesty when the editorial team smells a turkey, contrasted against the fawning praise reserved for the genuinely cracking software. You obviously cannot discuss this without tipping your hat to GoldenEye 007. Even reading this snapshot feels historic. It was the title that convinced every living room player that you could indeed shoot in 3D without tearing your hair out. Then you've got Diddy Kong Racing. Rare really did craft something magical here. Merging a sprawling collectible adventure mode with tight responsive racing mechanics was a masterstroke that really deserved all the credit it garnered at the time. It made the console feel vibrant and exciting, leagues above the usual drab experiences found elsewhere. Blast Corps deserves another nod for its absolute brilliance. Who knew that being tasked with leveling entire city blocks with a selection of unwieldy machinery could be so satisfyingly precise? It's a weird premise that works beautifully. Speaking of atmosphere, Doom 64 truly captured the essence of impending dread. It felt darker, faster, and punchier than almost anything else on the block. Lilac Wars, meanwhile, brought that mandatory arcade-style adrenaline spike. Those missions had us replaying stages until our thumbs practically gave up the ghost. And as for the rest, we best forget the disaster that was FIFA 64, which serves only as a reminder that early sports titles were once truly woeful. Thank goodness International Superstar Soccer 64 was there to salvage our digital pitch experiences. Then you have Duke Nukem 64, an abrasive, funny, and crude romp that remains a staple of many collections even today. The directory here captures that mix of triumph and error perfectly. Some games are essential staples of the history, while others are just cautionary tales. Pick wisely, because not everything that shines on the N64 was gold. The next section dives deep into the guts of the early catalogue, proving that while we had absolute, system-selling masterpieces, we were equally buried under a deluge of yearly sports updates that arguably should have stayed in the dressing room. Take Wave Race 64. Honestly, the water effects alone were an engineering flex that shamed pretty much everything else for years. You remember that sensation of leaning into the controller, wrestling the jet ski over a wave that felt realistically heavy? It wasn't just a racing game, it was an act of wizardry. Then there is Mario Kart 64, the absolute titan of playground arguments. It doesn't matter how many decades pass. Hearing the iconic music instantly transports you back to ruined friendships and frantic sweating palms. A proper cornerstone of the hardware. And Super Mario 64, simply there on the list, effectively defining how characters behave in 3D space. Do you recall that first jump into Bobo MB Battlefield? Everything was suddenly a playground of infinite movement. It makes the rest look positively archaic in comparison. Then things get a bit messy. Turok, let's be fair, we were all pretending the oppressive fog was a stylistic choice, rather than a clever way to hide that the console couldn't draw 3 trees ahead of the player. Still, putting a prehistoric beast down with a tech bow remains an unmatched joy. Mortal Kombat Trilogy, on the other hand, was always a bit of a jagged mess compared to the sleek fluidity of our premier platformers, but the spectacle was usually worth the frustration. The directory's look at import titles is a slightly depressing reminder of all the experimental Japanese gems we didn't get, like Ganbare Goemon. Mind you, flagging Clayfighter 63 1/3 as possibly the worst game in the world is the sort of sharp, no-nonsense critique that these magazines excelled at. As for the parade of sports titles like Madden, NFL Quarterback Club, NBA Hangtime, and Wayne Gretzky's 3D hockey, they've largely vanished into a mist of obsolete rosters and awkward menu navigation, mercifully forgotten by anyone who didn't possess an inexplicable desire to manage stats instead of playing real games. Focus on the jewels, discard the gravel. The next page of our directory pulls us into the muddy trenches of obscure imports, where one realizes the sheer quantity of titles that seem desperate to clutter our living rooms. Looking down this list, one is struck by the overwhelming barrage of Japanese baseball and soccer games. Whether it is Power Pro Baseball, Power League 64, or the endless parade of J-League titles. Do you remember when a new football game meant nothing more than swapping a few pixels and hoping no one noticed the distinct lack of innovation? They were the filler that made the cartridge library look robust, yet frankly, none of us possessed the Japanese language skills or the patience to care. Then there is the persistent Mahjong fatigue Mahjong 64 and Mahjong Master staring back at us like unwanted house guests. Unless you were a retired civil servant with a profound love for tiles, these were merely shelf space hoarders. Thankfully, sanity finally intervenes with WCW vs NWO World Tour. This, quite simply, was the watershed moment for wrestling on the hardware. You remember the revelation of that grapple system? It turned the genre on its head, giving us the first title that actually felt responsive and satisfying to play with a mate. Compare that achievement to the stiff, robotic animations of Mace, the Dark Age, or the grim War Gods. It's almost quaint how Midway kept churning out these ugly 3D fighters while pretending they were competing with the top dogs. And MK Mythologies, Sub-Zero? A title that stripped away the gore that made the franchise iconic, leaving us with a clumsy, side-scrolling experiment that went about as well as a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. Fortunately, we had the brilliance of Tetrisphere to fix our broken brains with psychedelic puzzles, and Mischief Makers stood as a brilliantly eccentric, vibrant platformer that refused to play by the rules. As for the technical directories on the right, it is essentially a time capsule of 1998 fax numbers and long-dead websites, much like that Total Film advertisement best left to the archives where the history of 1998 belongs. Next we have a glorious slice of 1998 retail. A full-page special reserve advert hawking, discounted cartridges, controller packs, and console bundles. A proper archaic mail-order relic for those nostalgic times.